We've covered how to spot a psychopath or sociopath before, but we've never gone this in-depth on the clinical diagnosis behind them, antisocial personality disorder. Welcome to the MedCircle series, Antisocial Personality Disorder, Psychopaths, Sociopaths, and How to Spot Them.
It's just so great to sit down with you.
I love talking with you.
Sometimes we talk about some topics that I think are really, really dreadful and hurtful.
Yeah.
And I think this series is going to be more in that lane.
Yes, it is, yeah. You brought up the cluster B.
Yeah.
Personality disorders. I think I'm so glad we're doing this, having this conversation, because a lot of folks out there are trying to make sense of these difficult patterns, and they put in all kinds of words into search engines online. Cluster B is something that comes out, and a lot of people don't know how to make sense of it. So let me give you some historical background. This word, cluster B, it comes from how the personality disorders were traditionally organized in the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry and Psychology, called the DSM. The DSM organized the personality disorders, there were 10 of them, into 3 groups: cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. And they organized the disorders based on their manifestations. Now, back in graduate school, we would remember these 3 clusters by calling them mad, bad, and sad. That's how we sort of memorized them. And by mad, it was sort of that traditional, like, madman, like, a person who's just really off and almost like, very disturbed. Bad meant almost badly behaved, and that's our cluster Bs, and sad were people who are more anxious and avoidant. The cluster B disorders are also termed dramatic and erratic. Now, these disorders, again, are grouped by sort of how they affect a person, and today we're going to focus on cluster B. The cluster B disorders are the difficult disorders. They're antagonistic. They're interpersonally challenging. These are folks who, as a rule, almost always lack empathy. They tend to be entitled. So it's almost like narcissism becomes a nice sort of like the midpoint of a lot of these disorders. Like, most of them have qualities of narcissism in different ways. And as you said, the 4 disorders that hang out in cluster B are antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and something called histrionic personality disorder. These are probably the most clinically vexing patterns we see in psychology and psychiatry, because they can make for very difficult clients. These patterns can interfere with us treating other issues the person may have, like substance abuse, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, the list goes on. If you have a cluster B disorder and these other things, you're constantly sort of like, it's like you're trying to like fight 2 different battles at the same time, and it's really one big kind of war, if you will. So it is a challenge, and it's a challenge for people not only living with the cluster B patterns, but also a challenge for the people living with those people who have cluster B patterns. So that's what cluster B is: dramatic, erratic, emotional, antagonistic, combative, lacking empathy, oftentimes internally very chaotic. They can't regulate their emotions very easily. And some of these are really clinically demanding. Borderline personality, for example, is a very clinically challenging condition. Narcissistic, histrionic clients, they don't even tend to end up in therapy that often. And antisocial personality disorder, those folks often end up in prison.
We've talked about specific personality disorders, but what is a personality disorder in general?
A personality disorder is a maladaptive pattern of behavior and relating that cuts across all situations in the person's life: relationships, work, social functioning, and even their sense of self. It's the long-standing stability that makes these be called personality disorders, because personality is considered to be a stable trait. But their personality styles cause the person problems in all areas of their life. But it's the maladaptive, consistent, and stable nature of these problematic personality patterns that lead to them being called personality disorders.
Can someone be diagnosed as having cluster B disorder? No.
Yeah,
you just have one of them, and then that's
yeah.
cluster.
What would end up happening is, like, for example, as you know, I do research on psychopathology and mental illness and mental health. So when we analyze our data, because these disorders are common, sometimes we'll combine these patterns to see if we see any patterns there. So partly it serves as sort of a research kind of an approach. It becomes a shorthand for clinicians, but we as clinicians have to be really, really careful about using that term, because cluster B is code for difficult patient. And there's a
Wait, that's
chance
really
you get-
big.
Yeah.
Cluster B is code for difficult patient. Now,
Yeah.
I can already hear people though saying, well, I'm watching that. My therapist said I have cluster B. Now that's rude. Why would you say I'm
It can
difficult?
feel rude. That's what I'm saying. We have to be very careful with these labels. It's really meant, it's almost like, again, it's an organizational scheme. If we see, because what may happen, Kyle, is a person may not meet the full diagnostic criteria for any one pattern of those disorders. We chose 4 disorders. They may have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And we might call it, this sort of has a cluster B pattern to it. It means that we might use very specific kinds of therapeutic techniques, or realize that these patterns may interfere with the treatment of other disorders, if you will. But it does imply typically somebody who's interpersonally difficult. I'll be honest with you, I mean, those of us in mental health will sometimes even use that as shorthand in our own lives.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to Thanksgiving, it's gonna be difficult, I have cluster B relatives there. You know, anyone in the business will know, like, she's got some really difficult family members. But it's beyond difficult. It's antagonistic and almost like they often don't get it.
Is it almost often that they don't want the help?
Not necessarily. I think, you know, because cluster B disorders take in so much territory, I work with many clients who have borderline personality disorder. They desperately want help. They desperately want help. In fact, sometimes need more help than even they can get in sort of like 1 or 2 weekly therapy sessions. And many clients with borderline personality disorder are very invested in getting that help, but it's difficult for them. They feel so internally chaotic and frightened that therapy can be challenging not only for them, but for the therapist who's trying to sort of soothe this patient. Obviously, when you're dealing with somebody with narcissistic personality, they don't think anything's wrong. So they're often going to think, I don't even need help. And then, you know, histrionic personality disorder, actually, they're thinking of removing that from the diagnostic manual. These are people who are dramatic and attention-seeking and seductive, and look at me, how come I'm not getting all the attention kind of thing. They almost also never end up seeking out treatment for that particular pattern. The folks with antisocial personality disorder also almost never seek out treatment. They get in trouble for something, and then they're sometimes forced into treatment.
Briefly describe what antisocial personality disorder is, because that name is so misleading.
Antisocial personality disorder is one of the most important and one of the most unfortunately named diagnoses out there. It throws my students off, it throws off trainees, it throws off lay people. Antisocial personality disorder is actually quite dangerous. It can be quite dangerous. It doesn't mean what we think. A lot of people take the antisocial to mean, oh, these are people who don't want to be with other people, almost as though they're socially anxious. Not at all. The unfortunate term historically came from this idea that these were people who were anti-society. They were anti the norms of society. They would break the rules of society. That was where the antisocial came from. Like I said, such an unfortunate name, because we use antisocial to mean someone who doesn't want to socialize. Like,
what would you call it?
I would call it psychopathic personality disorder.
Yes.
That's what I would term it. And antisocial personality disorder is the diagnostic term for things that are called psychopathy and sociopathy in the popular literature, in the media at large, in all kinds of other writing, in criminology writing, but it's not a diagnostic, those are not diagnostic terms, but those two terms definitely ascribe more to antisocial personality disorder. Now, what is it? Antisocial personality disorder is a pattern whereby a person not only lacks empathy, but they think the rules do not apply to them, they do not adhere to them, they break moral codes, social codes, legal codes, they have a failure to take any kind of responsibility, they're very deceitful, they exploit other people to achieve their ends, they will take risks that will put other people in danger, so they're dangerous. They're dangerous. And here's the ringer. I personally think that to really call it antisocial personality disorder, you're talking about someone who lacks remorse for the bad things they do, and that's where it gets scary.
Can they fake it?
That's where it gets scary. I'm sorry?
Can they fake it?
Can a person fake,
remorse.
They fake remorse? Oh, absolutely. You can fake anything. You can fake empathy, you can fake remorse, you can fake anything, and they do. They will, when they're finally hauled in front of the press conference, they'll cry crocodile tears, and a year later they'll do it again. That's antisocial personality disorder.
Which clusters of disorders do you think are most common?
In terms of the personality disorders overall, I actually think that the cluster B disorders may be more common, and the only reason I think I'm going to say that is because when we do research on these disorders, they're the ones that are more clinically compelling. So we may see more clients with these patterns because, especially in the case of borderline personality, they're more likely to get help.
That's right.
In the case of antisocial personality disorder, they're more likely to end up in prison. So there are these two groups of folks we study a lot because of the sort of the distress we see in borderline personality and the danger that can be created by antisocial personality. So if you were, and there's 4 disorders in that group too, so it's going to up your number up a little bit. I think that the cluster B disorders probably are the ones that have the highest prevalence rates across the 3 groups overall. Yeah.
Well, you have more disorders and people are having to go get help. So that
they're
makes
more
sense.
disruptive. That's who you're going to see. I'd say if you were working in the mental health business, you'll see that a lot. In cluster C, there's things like avoidant personality disorder, which is, it almost looks like a social anxiety disorder. So you will see that sometimes, but sometimes we don't even know which variant we're seeing, social anxiety or avoidant personality. And with the cluster A disorders, the schizoid, the schizotypal, the paranoid personalities, these are people who actually look quite severely mentally ill. They're incredibly either socially withdrawn or they appear as so odd, they almost look psychotic. They're sometimes overrepresented in residentially unstable, like homeless populations, or people who are in and out of long-term psychiatric facilities.
Is there hope for people who are in the cluster B camp?
In terms of hope for cluster B clients, it varies. It varies.
Hold on. We don't hear that answer a lot.
Oh, it varies, yeah. And that's the problem. That speaks to how heterogeneous the disorders that make up this cluster are.
If I talk about bipolar disorder, if I talk about anxiety, depression, ADHD, the doctor across from me will say, there's so much hope.
No, very variable. I would say that the most good research on treatment outcomes and best practices can be found for borderline personality disorder. I believe firmly that if you have a client with borderline personality disorder and you can give them trauma-focused care, dialectical behavioral therapy, whatever psychiatric medications they may need to manage other sorts of conditions they have, and other kinds of adjunctive therapies that will help them with their symptoms, the treatment literature can really show some good long-term outcomes, but the treatment has to be consistent and long-term, and that's often beyond the financial ability of a lot of people. That's what's so unfortunate, because I think there is tremendous hope for people with borderline personality if they get the kinds of treatment. And if the client won't cooperate with the treatment, then all bets are off. With narcissistic personality disorder, you know what I say about that, you're not going to see much change. And when you do, it's glacial, and the amount of change you see is often not enough for the people around them to feel like things are better. But with antisocial personality disorder, that disorder might be the most hopeless of all. These are folks who will try to outwit and outfox a therapist, who will fake it and are often court-ordered to go to therapy as a condition of parole or probation or something like that. And so they'll sit there for 10 sessions and say, I don't need to say anything, I just need you to sign that document that I came here for 10 sessions. So you can get a lot of resistance, and they can often try to intimidate a therapist. You have to be a very specially trained therapist to work with that population, particularly those who have very, very difficult criminal histories. And if you're dealing with sort of the more neat and tied up antisocial personality disorder, like the CEO variant, they're very manipulative. They can be very exploitative. Again, they will often try to outwit the therapist. They're really not motivated to change because they really, truly don't think there's anything to change. So if anything, they're just really out to game the system. That's not progress. So I would say definitely for them, of all groups, they'll have the worst outcomes.
What percentage of your clients do you think fall in the cluster B category?
With some cluster B symptomatology, well over 50%. Maybe even a little less. Actually,
I thought you were going to say 5%.
Oh, heck no. No. And actually, that's what I choose to focus in. But maybe 40%, 40%.
You know,
yeah.
that is good, though, because now at least people are getting help or in the space to get help.
And there are people out there who specialize in this, like people who specialize in dialectical behavioral therapy, it's called DBT. I'd say they see 90% because they're working with clients who have a lot of borderline personality sorts of symptoms. People who work in prisons are probably seeing antisocial personality at the level of 60, 70%. But I'd say almost half of the clients I work with, I choose to do that though, because like I said, although I would say maybe even, all right, I'll be 35%, because the majority of clients I work with are trying to negotiate a family or other relationship with a person with a cluster B disorder, a solid third of them are struggling with these issues.
Well, that leads perfectly into my next question. Knowing that if somebody has watched this video this far, they have been likely given a diagnosis of a disorder in the cluster B family, or they know somebody who has, what could I ask them on their behalf that you would think would be most beneficial for them to hear?
I think that the big question people have is, from the person, there's two sides of it. From the side of the person who's experiencing it is, what do I do? I'm not only always miserable, I feel like I'm making people miserable. And then from the other side, I think the question would be, what do I do? I feel like nothing I say to this person ever makes things better. In fact, all I do is feel like things get worse, and I feel like I'm always walking on eggshells. What do I do?
And
so it's really, what do I do?
Yeah, what's the answer to that?
I mean, for the people who are experiencing this symptomatology, you got to get therapy. You're not going to think your way out of this one. You're not going to meditate your way out of this one. You got to get therapy, and with somebody who is trained in things like DBT and working with these kinds of patterns. Okay, that's have to. You have to.
Dr. Yip is one of the nation's leading experts on OCD, and I interviewed her for our OCD series. She really drove home the point of, don't just go get therapy because the therapist said, yeah, I treat OCD. Go find the person who that's what they do.
That's what they do.
They are OCD, right? So with these people, I feel bad for someone who might have gone to a therapist who said they could treat it, but they did it once 10 years ago and they had a bad experience.
Yeah. I think that especially with something like narcissistic personality disorder, if you actually do get them to therapy, you can use a combination of some DBT techniques, but also some cognitive behavioral work, some humanistic work, rapport building. It's relationship building. You need a strong therapist to work with those clients because they will try to outfox you. And so you almost have to be one step ahead of them. Like you can't fall for the charm. You have to be almost charm immune or charm proof to work with the narcissistic clients. With the so it's all about expertise, but the borderline clients are the ones who are most likely to actually seek out therapy. And for them to say, like I said, you do it right. What do? You need to get help from somebody who knows what they're doing. And it might even be a team of people who know what they're doing. In fact, DBT is best delivered in a team approach with a combination of group therapy and individual therapy and some medication management. On the other side of it, if somebody in your life is experiencing these cluster B patterns, it's going to be difficult. I'm telling you that right now. And you're not a bad person for thinking it's difficult. Because a lot of people, I feel guilty, there's actually something happening to them. How dare I think that this is difficult? Because it is. Because the nature of these patterns is somewhat antagonistic. Again, it may be that they're feeling insecure or chaotic inside, and that's why they're lashing out. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. When somebody lashes out, it doesn't feel good, regardless of the reason. And so I will tell people, if you are with somebody who's experiencing cluster B patterns, definitely seek out individual therapy. You may need to manage your expectations of that person, and then ask yourself, what would the landscape of a relationship look like with this person if things don't change? Because in many cases, it may not change.
Those are really good 3 takeaways. Real quick for people watching, explain briefly what DBT is.
Yeah, DBT is Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. Dialectical Behavior Therapy was developed by someone named Dr. Marsha Linehan, and she developed DBT actually specifically to address the crisis of suicidality in people who had borderline personality disorder, because that's the dangerous issue. People with borderline personality are experiencing so much inner pain and turmoil that they want to silence that pain. They truly do believe often they're a burden to others, that they're not worthy to live. It's really agonizing for them and for the people around them who care for them. And so DBT was initially really developed as a way for the person living with borderline personality disorder to see how life always feels like a crisis to them, how everything is black or white. And so the dialectic is really to bring those two sides, those two perspectives together and find that gray in the middle. The other thing that Dr. Linehan brought into this work was a real focus on mindfulness. People with borderline personality disorder tend to react instead of responding. Responding is a more thoughtful approach. Reacting is like you jump right in. Through DBT, using mindfulness and sort of catching yourself, you help people construct more responsive rather than reactive kinds of approaches when they're faced with a stressor. You know, because the reacting often means people's feelings get hurt, people get angry, but to help them deal with that crisis and the fears that overtake a person with borderline personality disorder, such as things like that they're going to be left, that they're going to be alone, that they can't take care of themselves. Many people with borderline personality disorder engage in a lot of negative self-talk. Dialectical behavioral therapy also draws from cognitive behavioral therapy, where you push back and say, you know, it's interesting you say all these terrible things about yourself, because my experience, and you really do point out to them the good things and the strengths, and you do some resilience building with them. So, and you have them do homework assignments between sessions, so they do a lot more monitoring, so they can start seeing their own patterns. DBT has been shown to reduce the rate of suicidal thoughts, suicidal actions in people with borderline personality disorder, and it's really the only evidence-based treatment we know of right now that has any consistently good outcomes in persons with borderline personality.
I just want to touch on two things you said that really struck a chord with me. The first one is mindfulness. It is becoming a reoccurring theme in all of my conversations about mental health.
Yes.
Which makes me think if there's one thing we all could do to make our lives better, it would be to be conscious of what we're doing, mindful of what we're doing. And then the second thing is that difference between reacting and responding.
Yeah.
That's huge.
We live in a very reactive world. I mean, especially when you think about tweeting and texting. And
responding to those tweets and texts.
But that's reacting to those tweets and texts.
Yeah.
Responding means you stop, you think, what's meaningful, what would make sure, how do I write this so I don't hurt people? You know, that it's actually beneficial to either the receiver or other people who will be seeing this message. You go through a series of cognitive steps. But unfortunately, technology doesn't, I mean, I wish all technology made you like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Like, you know,
that's an app idea.
And then, you know, and honestly, they made you, like, it went 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And then another, are you sure? And then another 60 seconds. And then, are you sure? Because by then, a lot of reacting would have come down, and you're like, oh, forget about it. It's not that important.
Yeah, I mean, think about those emails that you write in a rage, and hopefully you don't send them, and you save it, and then the next morning you read it and go, thank goodness I didn't send that
Never
email.
ever put a name in a subject line of an email until you're ready to send it. That's sort of a bit of advice. But it's that react, respond, and mindfulness are linked. And because everything these days is so quick, and we're judged on speed, and everything's designed not only for speed, but not to catch ourselves before we go off the edge, that we can send things without, you know, back in the day, you'd have to like write the letter, fold the letter, put the letter in the envelope, find the stamp, write the address, go to the mailbox. That was 9 times you could have said, maybe I shouldn't send this. You know, and so that's where that mindfulness is a stop, it's a feel, it's a think, but that does mean awareness of other people. And if you don't have empathy, all the mindfulness in the world may not necessarily pay out.
Let's get into it. What is antisocial personality disorder?
So antisocial personality disorder is a long-standing pattern of inability to comply with moral, legal, ethical, or social codes, or really an unwillingness to do so. These are people that are characterized by lying, deceit, malice, lack of empathy. They exploit other people. They break the law. They lack responsibility. They don't follow through on things. They have very checkered work histories, that kind of thing. They'll use aliases. They'll put other people at risk. And they lack remorse or guilt or shame for the bad things that they do. So that's what antisocial personality disorder is. Now, there's a little interesting wrinkle in this diagnosis. In order for a person to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, we also have to establish they had a diagnosis of something called conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. Conduct disorder probably best sort of ascribes to what we might call juvenile delinquency. These are kids who were who've either engaged in illegal activities like theft or assault, but also things like torturing animals, setting fires, bullying peers, abusing, taking advantage of peers, and that could even include like sexually exploiting younger peers. There's sort of almost a willful cruelty, even though they're children, and they often won't show remorse or even recognition of what the ramifications of these actions are. So these are kids who may end up in juvenile detention, who will have trouble with educational systems, may drop out of school. So you have to establish this track record that they were a kid who would have these kinds of problematic behaviors prior to the age of 15. And then after the age of 18, we diagnose antisocial personality disorder.
So they don't have to get the diagnosis before the age of 15 because someone could skip it.
Someone could skip it. In fact, they often do.
Right, but you would go back and tell me about when you're teenage years and then go, you probably had
Yeah, and they'll say, I skipped school all the time and I got expelled, or I assaulted a kid, or I assaulted a teacher, or I stole my dad's money, that kind of thing. You know, it doesn't have to all be big ticket stuff. It could be the if you will, the kind of bad childhood behavior like bullying or stealing candy a lot or stealing other kids' lunch money, that sort of thing, those kinds of patterns, yeah.
To play devil's advocate though, couldn't that just be a symptom of bad parenting?
Sure, it could, absolutely.
But you still get the disorder diagnosis?
You could, yeah, because even still, that bad parenting is the predictor of lots of psychiatric disorders. You know what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, parenting has a lot to do with what gets shaped. Is it a guarantee? So if a person has a traumatic, neglectful, or invalidating childhood, is that a guarantee that things will go wrong for them in adulthood? Absolutely not. But is it a vulnerability? Absolutely.
What does it mean to be a psychopath?
So here's where things start getting into, we get into sort of interesting sort of semantic territory here. To be a psychopath, it's a term that probably ascribes best to this thing we're calling antisocial personality disorder. So psychopath is not a diagnostic term. It's a descriptive term, it's a sociological term, but it's definitely not a diagnostic term, okay? But researchers will use it and that sort of thing. So a psychopath is somebody who tends to be very calculating, manipulative, cunning, smart, malevolent, dangerous, exploitative. They have very little empathy. They don't really think through the consequences of their actions. They really don't care about the consequences of their actions. They break rules, ethics, laws. They violate moral codes. They're deceitful. A real picnic.
Yeah, love to meet one of those. But it's not actually, you can't be diagnosed as a psychopath.
Yeah, so if a person met those criteria, and this is a long-standing pattern for them since childhood, we call it antisocial personality disorder, yeah.
I understood. What about a sociopath?
So sociopath, this is where people get very confused, okay? So psychopathy and sociopathy are very, like, you know, they're like the Venn diagrams. There's a lot of overlap, but they're distinct entities. The sociopath in many ways is not as glib, socially skilled, successful, and manifest as well put together in the way the psychopath does. The psychopath in some ways is more chilling because they have an absolute lack of empathy. And if they have a relationship with someone, it is solely exploitative. It's to get something from them: sex, money, power, connections, you name it. The sociopath, in their very unskilled way, might get into a human relationship, but they still don't have any empathy. And in that relationship, they still remain very cold and still somewhat calculating, but really more cold and rejecting. The psychopath makes a better criminal. The sociopath tends to be messy, sloppy, and reactive. Your sociopath is your bar fighter. The psychopath is a person who will kill that person 3 days later methodically. You see what I'm saying? So it's like the sociopath tends to be more reactive. They tend to be more sloppy. They don't tend to be as planful. They're not as sophisticated as the psychopath, who tends to be coolly efficient, and in that way almost more dangerous. Absolutely. Because there was a book that was written called The Mask of Sanity, and that's where he was describing psychopaths in that book. And it was this idea that the psychopath can look sane because there was some research that estimates that corporate heads, like heads of major corporations of all kinds, the rates of psychopathy in those folks is 5 to 21%.
5
to 21. So depending on how you measure psychopathy.
So it could be 1 out of 5 major CEOs as a psychopath.
Hell yeah, yeah, yeah. Because there's all the stuff that the power drive, the willingness to have that sort of take no prisoners attitude, to power in this absolutely almost scarily surgically precise focused way. That's very profitable.
In preparing for this interview, I was researching the term psychopath, and it was almost, I would say 80% of the time correlated with serial killers. almost like it was an interchangeable term, like almost all serial killers are psychopaths.
Probably almost all of them are, because there's a precision to being a serial killer, right? Because in order to be a serial killer, you have to have killed 2 or more people. So you got away with 1, right? So you got away with 1, and there tends to be some very stereotyped stuff around serial killings, the keeping of trophies, the taunting of law enforcement, almost getting some pride out of like getting everyone in the world rattled and paying attention to what you're doing. If you even think of folks like the Son of Sam or the Zodiac Killer, they were actually writing letters to the newspapers and to journalists and even to the police, to, you know, even Jack the Ripper did that.
Yeah.
And so it's this sense that there's something, again, very methodical, and there's almost a sadistic pleasure that they're deriving from committing these crimes. That's very much the psychopath's game, because it's very planful. They think about it.
So I just can't believe that those people who are likely a psychopath, and perhaps 1 out of every 5 CEOs are also a psychopath, are in the same category.
Well, think about where the overlaps are. The utter lack of empathy, the precision, the singular focus.
Yeah.
Very similar in those 2 ways.
So could you have... No, because you have to have utter lack of empathy. I was thinking, could you have a psychopath who uses his makeup for good, but it's not that way?
No, because ultimately it's self-serving. So I guess maybe the only way you might see that is, let's say you have a psychopath out there who is running this incredibly successful corporation, but in order to sort of launder money or to distract people, raises tens and tens of millions of dollars for charitable causes. And that money really does go to protecting people, feeding people, giving them health care or something like that. So it's dirty money, but people get helped, and let's face it, that does happen, you know, more than we like to think. Philanthropic psychopathy. So, you know, it's money laundering to them, people benefit. I mean, I guess viewers out there could think about, is it worth it if somebody gets help that they wouldn't have gotten helped otherwise, but the money came from a really manipulative place?
Out of curiosity, if you're watching this, do you feel like your boss is one of those who are 5% or 21% likely to be a psychopath? I've never worked for a psychopath. I can say that in all certainty.
I don't think I have worked for a psychopath. I've worked for people who are deeply, deeply, deeply narcissistic. But a full-on psychopath, you tend to see them in more competitive industries, media, business, law, maybe even sometimes medicine, like high stakes, athletics, that kind of military. High stakes, high visibility kinds of spaces where the profit lines are high and the stakes are high. I mean, let's face it, when you hire people to do a job, you're not doing a personality test. You're looking at what they can do. And if they're making money and you're hiring for a company, then you're going to look at the person who hires money, and you may not ask questions about how they're getting that done until after the fact.
When does someone, going back to antisocial personality disorder, when does someone cross the line between, or from suave confidence to antisocial personality disorder?
I mean, obviously someone being suave and confident is not a diagnosis or an indictment. It is to me, actually. When I meet suave people, I get really put off. Like, to me now, charming people are terrifying. Is that a
Ramani tip?
Yeah, it's a Ramani tip.
That's like, a personal Ramani tip.
If I meet charming people, I tend to excuse myself to the restroom, and I will often join another table or something. It terrifies me.
Okay, so if we didn't know each other and we're at a party and I go, "Oh, Dr. Ramani, I've seen your videos on MedCircle. Let me get you a drink. You look fantastic tonight. I love your shoes. Wow, you're so smart and intelligent." You would go, "Oh my gosh, thank you.
You would have lost me at, I love your shoes.
I gotta probably start watching how I act around these mental health professionals, because I tend to be very complimentary.
Yeah, but complimentary. But then there's a point to which, like, I don't. What's your angle?
Yeah.
You know, that's the struggle there. So this idea, then, where's the line, right? Suave and charming and sophisticated and all of that. What you're looking, though, too, is to see, is there empathy? Is there a meaningful give and take in the conversation? Are they looking through you, or are they looking at you? Are they actually interested in what you're saying? And if you continue to spend time with them, are they present? Are they reciprocal? Are they warm? How do they treat other people? So obviously, if they're not mistreating other people, if they don't have a track record of having done bad things, that kind of thing, then they're not. Then they're suave and charming.
Yeah.
And they're not a psychopath. No, obviously not all. Most charming people are not psychopathic.
Sure.
But it's, again, when you do what I do, charm gets scary.
Well, let's dive deeper into that. What does the average person who has antisocial personality disorder look like? What do they physically look like? How do they dress? How do they carry themselves?
That's a tricky question because there is no average person with antisocial personality disorder. You can find people with antisocial personality disorder everywhere from death row to the best table at the best restaurant in Los Angeles. So it's
that might be how they got there.
You know,
in both instances.
Yeah, absolutely. That their personality disorder is likely what got them there. So they look very different. They can be in a $5,000 suit or a $10 prison jumpsuit. They can be in any number of professions. They could be any race. Definitely proportionally more men, many more men.
How many more do you think?
I would say if I were to spitball, because I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, I would hazard a guess it's probably 5 to 1, 8 to 1 men versus women.
5 to 1,
8 to 1, something like that. Yeah, it's quite a few, many more men. Yeah. Are there women with antisocial personality disorder out there? Of course there are, of course. But for sure you would see, the only thing I could say in common is this would be a man. That's the best I got for you. You know, but beyond that, like I said, they could be successful, they may not be successful, they could be living in the streets, they could be living in a mansion. That's where it's interesting. Whereas with other mental illnesses, we might actually see sort of a truncation, but even there, we look at substance abusers, they can be fabulously wealthy, or they could be living in the streets, you know, they can be any race or ethnicity, they could be, any gender. It doesn't matter.
You are the country's leading expert on narcissism, perhaps the world's leading expert on narcissism at this point.
That would be very narcissistic for me to believe that.
That's why you're the expert. You already caught it out. How is this different, though, than narcissism?
It's a very good question. What I view them as on a continuum. And here's a good rule of thumb. All people with psychopathy are narcissistic. Not all narcissistic people are psychopathic.
Got
it.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, I would say nearly all people with antisocial personality disorder are narcissistic, but not the other way. Not all people with narcissistic personality disorder have antisocial personality disorder. I would never diagnose both. If you have antisocial personality disorder, it's a built-in that you have many traits of narcissistic personality. So it's a continuum of sorts. It really is. And so narcissism there's a form of narcissism we sort of term malignant or toxic narcissism. These are people who have all the stuff associated with narcissism, like the lack of empathy, entitlement, et cetera, but there's also a really hard, manipulative, exploitative edge to them. And they tend to be the more deceitful, interpersonally brutal narcissists. And then when you look at what a psychopath or a person with antisocial personality disorder, now you jump the rails into a space where a person does not feel remorse for the bad things they do. People with narcissism actually do feel guilty or shameful when they do a bad thing. They will, more shame than guilt, because shame's a very public emotion, but they'll definitely feel bad about it, whereas a person with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy in general won't. As a technical matter, and it's a fine point, but I want to make it. The way DSM allows us to diagnose antisocial personality disorder, symptom number 7 is the one that's called lack of remorse. Okay, there's a specific symptom called lack of remorse. You can get the diagnosis, though, even if you do feel remorse. Yeah. And I struggle with that because I have interviewed, and in my research, we've interviewed many people who will say, I did a bunch of really bad stuff. And I did this bad stuff because I was living in a very dangerous neighborhood in Los Angeles. I came up with the wrong kids.
I get that.
I had an abusive family.
I get that.
I was gang involved. We stole, we assaulted, I did time, and I feel awful about the lives I ruined. And they're genuine. They've done their time, and they're actually now devoting their lives to better work. They're participating in research. Like, they feel bad.
Yeah.
And the remorse rang true. So they didn't get, in our research, they didn't get that, but they still got the diagnosis.
I get that.
Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas psychopathy requires that lack of remorse.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Ramani and I sat down for an entire series on narcissism, and if you would like to watch that, here is a little preview.
So when we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, there's a long list of patterns, and they have to have 5 of the 9 on that list. It has to be something we call pervasive, meaning it cuts across situations with a variety of people, at work, at home. It's not just like they're narcissistic to only you and they're nice to everyone in the world. It tends to be pervasive. But here's the rub. It has to involve what we call social and occupational impairment, and subjective distress. That's a fancy way of saying it is messing up that person's life. They're aware it's messing up their life, and they're uncomfortable with it. And that's where you don't see as many people with narcissistic personality disorder.
Dr. Ramani, can sociopathic or can someone have sociopathic and psychopathic traits without having antisocial personality disorder?
Yes, they can. Actually, you can see that. Now, here's a rub. It's like, again, antisocial personality disorder has such a sort of specific diagnostic set of criteria, in terms of the early life experience and all of that, you may have that person who is coolly efficient and manipulative and singularly focused on success and lacks empathy and exploits other people. Maybe they'll come in right under the threshold. At this point, we're sort of really, we're splitting hairs. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Like, who cares what the word is?
Thank you.
It's dangerous. Yeah. It's problematic. Yeah. My work in this area is very much focused on how people with these patterns affect people in relationships. I can tell you this now, people with psychopathy and sociopathy 100% are not built for close, intimate relationships. They cannot put the roots down deep. And I think what ends up happening is because they're so smooth and charm and glib and successful, they absolutely draw partners in. Many times for the psychopathy, it's like big game hunting. They just want the trophy. They want the prize of it all. Or they value that partner. They're very attractive. They're very wealthy. They're very successful. They may be a bridge to something they want, or they just want sex. Yeah. It can literally be that simple. And in fact, you do see that in when we look at the hair psychopathy checklist, which is a very famous, frequently used checklist research
Did you
scale.
Say the hair?
The hair.
Like hair?
Hair like a bunny.
Oh, okay.
The hair psychopathy checklist, in that checklist, one of the items gets at their inability to be in long-term relationships, like they have very short-term marriages kind of thing, because oftentimes they're exploitative, they want something and they get out, or they just have very brief sexual unions, they're very sexually exploitative. They'll use people for sex and then just sort of spit them up and chew them out and leave them out. And so people are very hurt by that. And they'll say, gosh, he was so charming. He seemed so into me. But that's because they're so charming. And
that's why you avoid charming people.
That's why I avoid charming people, because really their damage comes from the fact that if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's so easy to get drawn in because it feels like a fairy tale. Little do we know that like many fairy tale princes probably are psychopaths. It's a new Disney.
Fairy tale princes are most likely a psychopath.
They're just a little too charming. I think we don't.
They're named Prince Charming.
Yeah, Prince Charming. Yeah, Prince Charming is more Prince Psychopathy to me.
Yeah. By the way, when people meet you now, they're not going to be very nice to you, I feel like, because they're going to be like, hey, I love you on MedCircle. Not a lot, just an appropriate amount.
Well, I get there's the narcissism woman. I'm like, no, not really. In fact, I'd actually be successful if I was narcissistic. But instead, actually stop and make sure everyone's okay.
Very funny. This does come with a lot of co-occurring disorders.
Yes.
What are the most common?
In antisocial personality disorder, the co-occurring disorders we most often see are substance use disorders. Interestingly, we might actually see depression, but it's probably woefully underdiagnosed because they'll probably present more as irritability.
Yeah.
What we call impulse control disorders, but the impulse control might be like they lash out at people, road rage, intermittent explosive disorder, but we may not diagnose both because it's likely that their rage and stuff is subsumed under the antisocial personality disorder. But really the most common comorbid diagnosis is going to be substance use.
Are there different forms of antisocial personality disorder?
In the diagnostic manual, there's antisocial personality disorder, and it doesn't have different kinds of descriptors, if you will. In my research, we've actually sometimes split them out by people who report having remorse versus those who don't. So it's not really differentiated in that way. In fact, the research on psychopathy actually takes the time to distinguish between psychopathy and sociopathy, or between primary and secondary psychopathy. There's different ways you can slice and dice that pie, and a lot of it has to do with the forward-facing characteristics, how intelligent, well put together, articulate, smart, charming, glib, all that stuff we associate with success, and that precision. That's sort of different than what I call kind of like the sloppy bar fight psychopathy or sociopathy.
Yes. Why, or rather, what would not be considered antisocial personality disorder, but often is? What type of behavior?
I would say that, I mean, again, many people mistakenly have called narcissists as having antisocial personality disorder. But if indeed that narcissist is like, I can't believe I did this, I'm so sorry, and they're apologizing and they go do it again, that's probably more of the narcissism piece. Bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder could be mistakenly diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder because it's very possible that during a manic phase, a person's behavior may drift into the illegal. They may use a lot of drugs. They may solicit the services of prostitutes and, behave very badly with them. They may gamble a lot of money and engage in illegal activity to get more money to gamble. So they may actually behave in a way that is risky and in violation of the law. So we'd have to be very, very careful to ensure that when there were these sorts of upticks of illegal behavior, that it occurred only during a manic episode. You got to remember, in antisocial personality, the behavior is consistent. It's not like 6 days a week they're a nice guy and only on day 7 do they go out and put their serial killer mask on. They tend to not work well in society. Even when they're charming and glib, they don't tend to have high quality, deep personal relationships.
Are people diagnosed with border or antisocial personality disorder when in fact they're bipolar?
They could be, but it's going to be, somebody should catch that pretty quick.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Because then they should recognize that that person is in an episode of mania and this has not been their typical pattern of behavior. But since one of the biggest errors we can make is make a diagnosis on the basis of a snapshot. If all you did was focus on one day of one person's manic episode, you could easily then completely call it something it's not. So that's why we have to look at psychiatric patterns over time. And so also in some substance abuse disorders, I could see how somebody who has a diagnosis of certain forms of substance abuse, particularly activating drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, people who use those drugs are more likely to engage in risky behavior. They may engage in illegal activities to procure the drug. They may sell the drug. They may engage in high-risk sexual activities while they use the drug. And if they're an addict and they're using regularly, that may contribute to the likelihood that they're engaging in these high-risk illegal behaviors, which over time could look like antisocial personality disorder. What would have to happen is get that person off the drugs, get them clean, see if the behavior changes or not.
I make a point to say this in almost every series because for me it is the difference between mental health therapy working or not, and that is people must get the right diagnosis.
Absolutely.
And do not take that as a new label or a new terrible thing that's wrong with you. Only take it as that's the next step to get the right treatment.
Well, yeah, and in fact, we don't have to call it a diagnosis. We can call it a pattern. This is the pattern I'm experiencing. I've been really, we're talking about depression, I'm sad, I'm more irritable than usual, so we're looking at patterns, and these are patterns that make a person uncomfortable and make it so that they're not achieving at their fullest potential. Because really my goal as a therapist is to get a person to achieve at their fullest potential, to be the best version of themselves.
Dr. Sue Varma in New York, we did a series with her on depression. She goes, my job is to give people, what you just said, an optimal life. That's what I do. People go, yeah, but I can deal with it. I go, you could, but why don't we work hard to make it even better? I love that. Yes, that's good. I want people to understand what we're doing here is providing the education so that they can get into the right people, get the right diagnosis, and get the right treatment.
And Kyle, I want to say something to that because I know many people who watch MedCircle have lived with and experienced, or may even currently be experiencing, mental health or mental illness issues. I always say to people, this is part of your story. And if you've come through this, and you will come through this, that's part of your strength and resilience. And it's not a piece of you to be forgotten. Because I work with clients, for example, who are healthcare practitioners, who are teachers. And we can use this as a way to say, you have an empathy that someone else may not. And you may be gentler with a patient, or you may be kinder to a student. And to me, I think that many times that people who've walked through the fires, that can be harnessed in a way that actually can not only bring you to a fuller potential, but benefit the people around you. It's really like spinning straw into gold. Absolutely. So I think that that's what's absolutely critical, is people don't view this as there's something wrong with you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. Everything's right. We just want to get you to a better place, but that you can use part of this part of your story to enhance the lives of others.
That's so beautiful. I would love to leave it right there, but I have more questions for you.
Good, great. Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
So I can't leave it on that perfect note that you just gave me. When it comes to antisocial personality disorder, what am I not asking you that I need to be asking you?
You know, antisocial personality disorder, the big question is, what if the big question around antisocial personality disorder really is, can it be treated? You know, to which I'm typically going to say the answer is no. In most cases, no. We do know that over time, people with antisocial personality disorder kind of get tired out. They kind of, it gets exhausting to be a person who keeps breaking the rules at 90 or 75. Like, you get tired. It's exhausting, right? But these are patterns that are very, 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 very resistant to change. These are folks that many therapists don't have the training to work with, nor do all therapists even want to work with this population. They feel threatened or intimidated, and nobody should ever work with a patient population they don't feel comfortable with. But there's typically no motivation for change because these folks don't think anything's wrong. You know, they really, and it's also, the question is, how does a person become this way?
Let's dive into that. Explain first the born part.
Yeah, so there is, you know, particularly in the area of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, there's actually been a lot of research done on sort of brain function in people with antisocial personality disorder. And there are various brain areas that have been implicated: the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the amygdala. All these fancy names are really simply boiled down to something's wrong upstairs. You know, their brains aren't the same as everybody else's. However, what these researchers have found is that those brain differences in structure and chemistry colliding with childhoods that may be characterized by abuse, neglect, violence, being the victim or witnessing violence, frankly, invalidation, emotional abuse, those things might potentiate any of those sorts of structural issues in the brain. We also know that there are areas in the brain that subserve empathy. And that when research, empathy. So the research has been done actually with people who qualify as sort of psychopaths or as antisocial personality disorder. I think they had been in prison. What they found was when they were able to tell the subjects in this research to think about something and force them into empathy. Like, they told them a story and say, can you really stop and think how that person in that story felt? And the person concentrated on how that person felt. That area of the brain lit up, but it wouldn't have happened naturally for them. So they don't naturally find themselves to empathy. So they're capable of what we might call cognitive empathy. They're like, yeah, I can get that. And that area of the brain will light up, but it doesn't happen spontaneously. So a relationship isn't really possible with them, but it's not entirely broken. You can turn the system on.
Wow. Now, if, I always take my glasses off when I get excited. If a child is born with something not functioning correctly upstairs, and it is a psychopathic or sociopathic tendency, and they don't have an environment that is violent, they actually live in a very supportive environment, can you raise somebody not to be that way?
I have read case literature of exactly what you're describing. A kid who is actually from the loving home. Parents who loved them, you know, a nurturing environment, plenty of resources. It wasn't an impoverished or dangerous community or anything. And that child started displaying antisocial tendencies, and it kept unraveling, and they became, you know, violent or predatory or poorly behaved adults, if you will. And those are case reports. That's not normative. That's definitely a very low probability event, if you will. But it's interesting. When you read some of the work being done by some of the really great researchers in this area, Adrian Rain, for example, is a guy at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's done some really great research on psychopathy. And, you know, I was reading something, an interview done with him, and he had said, like, listen, we're going to get to the point where we may be able to identify some of these patterns in children. And if that's the case, we really should work with parents to help them identify some of these patterns early on to see if we can do some intervention with them. We're not quite there yet, but I must say that when we see kids who are engaging in patterns of behavior like bullying or acting out, we have to spend the time to do the necessary assessments to determine what might be going on for that child, both at home and in school, and what behaviors are manifesting. Because it is possible in some of these cases, if we could get ahead of some of this, then sure, we might be able to engage in some prevention work. But that's difficult to do. You know, you can only mandate so much.
That I understand. When we have the behavior, we try to fix it.
You're saying just on the basis of the brain.
Yeah, because that's the mental health landscape is so gray.
Yeah.
And what's so frustrating to a lot of people is that it's just a expert's opinion whether or not their kid has ADHD or their kid has bipolar disorder or that their cousin is depressed. It's just somebody's opinion on that. So when we can have something more definitive that can be tested, that's so exciting to me.
That's what the hope has been. And of all the personality disorders, really antisocial personality disorder is the area where a lot of this work on the central nervous system and the activity of the central nervous system is being conducted. And you know, the challenge is, what do? You give everyone in America a brain scan?
No, can't do that.
So you see what I'm saying? So it's sort of like, where do we go with this? And the findings right now are very subtle. A lot of them happen after the fact. So a person goes and does bad things, and then we do the scan. What other things happen in their life?
That's right.
You know, and some of the research hasn't been as good at sort of describing how much abuse or deprivation or all those other kinds of conditions are present. How much of that shaped their brains? And that's the thing. The brain is shaped by its environment. So you have a bit, we're kind of playing a chicken-egg chase game here. But definitely both things are at play. There are vulnerable brains out there, and when that vulnerable brain meets an invalidating environment, that's sadly where the issues arise.
Do you think we would ever get to a point where we would do a scan on kids scan their brain, and we could say, yes, they are likely to be a sociopath or psychopath?
Not in our lifetimes. I don't think so. I think that I wouldn't be surprised if slowly we get there. Remember, the brain is a very complicated system. It's not so simple as like, there's like a little, other organ systems are much more.
We've created an entire business around the brain.
Other organ systems are a lot more straightforward, but the brain hides for secrets. And you know, you could have 4 scans that look similar, and yet the behavioral manifestations could be quite different, because it's an intersection of so many things. Everything from the person's gender to their ethnicity to where they live to what their parents did to what kinds of early environment they had. You know, it's not that simple. Would that it were, but we're not there. That this extraordinary thing called the brain is, you know, that allows us to do everything from, you know, write poetry to fall in love to, you know, drive a car. It's not that simple. And I don't think we're going to get it. We want it to be that simple. We want to be able to predict these patterns. I think it's a pretty high order. It feels like a science fiction film to me, but who knows? Maybe neuroscience will prove me wrong.
Do you think, or is there any proof that any of this is hereditary?
There is some evidence showing that it runs in families. Now, it's particularly father to son. And as we talked about, these rates are higher in men. When we talk about antisocial personality disorder from a more biological model, one of the things we talk about is something called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has an arm of it called the sympathetic nervous system that we popularly refer to as the fight or flight system. But the autonomic nervous system is associated with arousal. So when we get worked up about anything, when we're frightened, when we're anxious, you know, anything that is threatening to us, we get aroused. Our heart rate increases, we sweat, our eyes become wide, we become short of breath. Those are we get our skin, you know, our hair stand up on edge kind of thing. All of those are autonomic signs. The belief is that people with antisocial personality disorder have lower autonomic arousal, meaning that under conditions of fear or threat, they don't get as aroused, which is why they're willing to take risks. And they don't have the same anxiety. We avoid things that make us anxious. Right? They don't get anxious, so they don't avoid those same things that are really high risk. And in fact, there's research that shows that people with psychopathy have lower resting heart rates. They just are more under aroused. So sometimes that manifests in them getting into really dangerous, thrill-seeking types of sports because they almost want to feel the arousal the rest of us feel on a regular basis, day after day. And that it's believed that autonomic nervous system under arousal could be inherited.
In our first video you and I ever made, I think it was our first one, you told a story saying that they could be in a car with a dead body in the trunk, get pulled over by the police, and be
they won't break
totally
a sweat.
cool.
Totally cool. Totally cool. Absolutely. They wouldn't even flinch.
Are those that's a sociopath?
That's a psychopath.
Or a psychopath.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they are born?
Psychopaths tend to be more born. Sociopaths are probably a little bit more made. You know, and I mean, that's a rule of thumb. That's not perfect science, but definitely you see that sociopathy tends to be a bit more a byproduct of the chaotic or negligent early environment, whereas psychopathy, you can have that. You can definitely have the negligent early environment. It's probably likely, but there's likely also that biological sort of piece. Again, the sociopaths tend to be a bit more sloppy, messy, reactive.
What age, in your personal experience, do you find psychopaths or sociopaths being diagnosed?
You can't diagnose them until they're over 18. I don't think it's a reliable diagnosis. None of the personality disorders are diagnosed in adolescence.
Except for the combative?
Conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is not a personality disorder. It's a childhood disorder.
Oh.
So you could diagnose a kid with conduct disorder because they keep breaking the rules.
Right.
It's possible that kid will not go on to develop antisocial personality disorder. If you're really, 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 really lucky, they'd be put into perhaps a juvenile center where they really get good rehabilitative care and they don't commit crime again. I mean, the odds are not in your favor, but it can happen that way. So conduct disorder is a disorder of childhood. Personality disorders are only diagnosed in adulthood. We're making room for the fact that the personality continues to evolve, shape, and grow during the adolescent years into emerging adulthood. I actually really wouldn't feel comfortable giving a definitive diagnosis of a personality disorder in anyone who's much younger than 20 or 21.
That's so fascinating. That was my next question too, where you would feel comfortable giving that diagnosis.
I mean, I would talk about patterns. I'd say you definitely have the traits here, but you also have a teenager. And I can tell you as the parent of teenagers, I think I've probably seen what feels like every personality disorder's symptoms in them. You know, I'm like, wow, they're being really narcissistic and unstable.
You,
I love them, but I was like, oh my gosh, goodness. And that's where I really learned that teenagers are up, down, and all around. And you know, again, that's a developmental issue, and that's why we want to be very careful. So the last thing you want to do is toss a label on an adolescent who's coming into their own and make them pathologize this process of them trying to find themselves. And if we look at any of ourselves when we were teenagers, we were anything but graceful.
Oh, goodness, that is the truth. In regards to antisocial personality disorders, what demographic besides men do you find more affected?
This is where it gets a little tricky sociopolitically. Unfortunately, what we see, and this is something that as I've reviewed the literature from my research, that these patterns tend to be overdiagnosed in people from lower income groups and ethnic minority groups. And the belief is that's because those groups are also disproportionately incarcerated and the target of law enforcement. So the belief is that it's almost like this sense of pathologizing people who are different than the norm. And that's why those statistics I think we have to be very, very, very careful with. So again, these disorders don't know to discriminate per se, but since they're based on moral, social, ethical, and legal codes, and those codes are enforced by other entities, now you're bringing politics in. You see, that's where it gets tricky, and that those things don't belong in mental health, but we have to be mindful of them. So and in fact, what we do sometimes see is that sometimes women who probably have antisocial personality disorder will get misdiagnosed with another syndrome such as borderline personality disorder because we don't think of women as having antisocial personality disorder. And there are men out there who might very well have borderline personality disorder who get diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So things like gender, race, social class, all of those things matter.
When a therapist or psychiatrist brings their own personal prejudices into their practice?
Bias, yeah.
Just the normal term bias.
It's bias, and that's why that, ideally you have multiple pairs of eyes on case data, which you don't always have, because I've been surprised when I do every so often get to see, past, diagnostic, systems laid on a client. I'm like, really? I got to say, I'm not seeing it this way. So it's not a precise science. That's why these labels don't tell us much. I think we're better off focusing on patterns.
Yeah,
on
patterns. In our lifetime, what do you hope or think that we could develop when it comes to the causes of antisocial personality disorder?
This is actually, a lot of what is being done in personality disorder research very much focuses on antisocial personality, because we do know it's dangerous to society. Mm-hmm. So what do I think we'll learn? I do think that newer and newer tools, neuroimaging tools that look at, namely functional neuroimaging tools that really look in real time at brain function, those are going to shed some really important light on how these brains work differently. And then once therapies or treatments are applied to folks, to see if you actually see any frank shift in functioning, and whether that's also associated with a behavioral change. Again, these are not patterns that are that amenable to change. I think that we might be able to isolate what the snapshot of what this looks like in the brain. Whether we can then act on it, there the jury is out. Would it then become something that's more medical? Is there medication that could be given? Is it surgical?
Right.
And then but you face bigger ticket issues like consent to treatment. Mm-hmm. We are in the United States of America, an adult has to consent to treatment. You can't just crack open a person's skull and start fiddling around in there. It's not how it works. Right. And so I think that as much as we think, well, there could be all these magical solutions, people have to agree to uptake therapy, and and there's reasons for that, obviously. Yeah. But if a person doesn't think something's wrong, whether it's psychotherapy, whether it's medication, whether it's newer therapies, newer sorts of brain stimulation techniques, whether it's psychosurgery, a person has to consent to that, and it has to be really medically indicated. So we have to be careful in how we think about those things.
Dr. Ramani, someone comes to you, a patient, and they say, my husband is a sociopath. I am convinced. What's your first reaction?
I first of all, I hear this regularly, and I get heartbroken for them. Because what it means that they've been enduring is somebody who is likely verbally abusive or ignoring them, neglectful, lacks empathy, is cruel, is cold, is distant, is manipulative. They use that one word, and it gives me some real insight into what they've been enduring. And by the time they pick up the phone and call me, it often means they've been enduring it for a while.
How severe do the symptoms of a sociopath become?
Like all disorders, it's on a range, right? It's not like there's one version. Obviously, in the milder levels, you're often talking about someone who's cold, angry, brooding, resentful, mean-spirited. At the more extreme levels, you'll see violence manifested. Yeah. So obviously, at the more extreme levels, you're often talking about victims of more physical domestic violence. But I think even at the mild levels, it can look like emotional abuse.
What if somebody comes to you and they say, I heard this word sociopath, and I'm not really sure what it is, but I think my husband might be one. How can I tell? I
break it down for them, because I think a lot of people use the word sociopath interchangeably with narcissistic.
Yeah.
And like I said, these are labels. I'm interested in the pattern. I'll say, don't use the word. Tell me what. It's like, don't show me a bucket, dump it out, and show me what's in it.
Yes.
Okay.
Great metaphor.
And so I say, tell me what the patterns are, and then once they start laying it out, I say, okay, here's what the pattern is. If it makes you feel better to have a word, because I know sometimes they want to keep digging and doing research. But then we break down that pattern. So when somebody is experiencing that, like I said, they're experiencing all those things: coldness, distance, manipulation, lying, all those things, and it almost doesn't matter whether it's a sociopath or a narcissist. Neither pattern is that amenable to change, and neither pattern feels good.
So they dump out the bucket, and they're pulling out verbal abuse, coldness, all of those things that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Who cares what we call it?
Right.
This type of person is unlikely to change.
No, they're not going to change.
They're not going to change. So that leaves that person with two options.
Yeah,
stay with it and deal with it, or get out.
And when I say they're not going to change, I say that very, as you can see, reflexively. Let's say you get that person who's like, okay, I never thought it would get to this point. You're leaving. Let me give this a shot. and they want to make a good faith attempt in therapy, and they're really owning it, and they get in there and they maybe make some minor changes. In some small percentage of cases, you might see that. Since most people out there and most people watching are not going to be the exception to the rule, I'm going with the idea if their partner is not endorsing any issues on their end, that they're responsible for any of this, then the likelihood of change is zero. You know, there have to be that acknowledgement of change. So assuming that that's what this person's like, they won't change, and when I bring it to their attention, they look at me like, you know, that's great. I'm not, you know, there's nothing wrong with me. This is you. And they'll often blame the person. So they'll say, you're an idiot. You're a fool. Maybe you're the one with a problem. Then they'll undergo a whole new litany of emotional abuse. So you're right. Their two options are to either get out or stay. And if they stay, to understand they're staying under conditions that really aren't going to shift that much.
But how able are we to unbiasedly tell a therapist how our significant other is?
No, I get it every day, 10 times a day. So people are, by the time, listen, you go into a therapist's office and you're paying good money, why would you lie?
I know, I'm not saying that they're lying. I'm saying if I say, all right, like my name's Jennifer and I have a husband named Paul, and I'm saying Paul is manipulative and cold and blah, blah. How accurate is that? Because maybe I'm just angry.
Okay, then in which case you're going to get your guidance from that perspective. And that's why it's great to work with couples, right? Because if you get to work with a couple, then you get to see both sides. Unfortunately, if Paul in fact is a sociopath, he's going to be manipulative. You know, so you have to be a really skilled therapist to sort of suss that out and smell that out. You'd be amazed how many clients pull out their phone and show me the text messages. And that's when I get a real sense of it. I see the emails.
This is so good.
Yeah.
I bet you people don't realize that they can even do that with a therapist.
They can't always. Some therapists, listen, when my clients come in, they might bring in old photo albums. I welcome all that. They show me the text messages, it helps. Your therapist, though, any of our viewers, your therapist may say no, and I don't ever want to impugn how another therapist works.
Okay.
So I'm not saying all of us will do that. I certainly will.
Okay.
Because because of the sheer number of clients I work with who have been in narcissistic or sociopathic or psychopathic relationships, it's really important to me to never gaslight my patients.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you're not telling me the truth. That's what the world has been telling this person for a while. Like, well, maybe it's not that bad. And they've been gaslighted by the world, and I refuse to be someone who does that. There's a reason this person picked up the phone, came to my office, spent the money to see me, and if it's to come in and say, I'm going to give you this sort of mythological version, and do I think sometimes clients do that? Absolutely, absolutely. And so then what's happening is, probably nothing is changing at home because I'm working in good faith. So at some point they're either going to stop coming because saying nothing you're doing is helping me. But I have to say that it is important for me to honor their truth. I'm a humanistic therapist, and and that's my orientation, to be humanistic existential. And a big part of that is that your truth is what matters to me. And for some reason you're coming in here and saying this is your experience of this person. And it's not my place to doubt that. I just want to understand it.
That is so good. I love the permission to bring evidence, is what I'll call it, to a therapist who's open for that.
You know why they do that though, Kyle? Sometimes people bring that in because they've been doubted by everyone, and they feel like they're losing their grip on reality. That's what gaslighting does to people. It tests your reality.
Yeah. And it could be going on for 20 years.
And sometimes to them, they've stopped trusting their own reality so much that they hand over the text messages because they don't think anyone will believe them. It's actually a rather heartbreaking gesture. I am not kidding you. I've had clients come in with boxes of stuff. And I mean, it's heartbreaking because I think, God, no one has been listening to this person. And they literally feel like they're losing their grip on reality. And that to me is devastating.
So Jennifer comes in. And she's irritated with her husband, Paul, because he's a sociopath. And you tell her, look, the evidence would suggest that he's a sociopath. But I would assume Jennifer didn't marry him when he was doing all those things.
Jennifer did. Here's the thing with these patterns: narcissism, sociopathy, psychopathy. These are long-standing patterns. Now, because of the charm, particularly we see in psychopathy and narcissism, they can often keep a lid on it long enough to get a ring on it, okay? Sociopathy tends to be a bit more sloppy. I'm not quite sure why people fall for that, but they do. Some people just desperately want to get married. and they're just sort of taking whatever person is in front of them, and they're like, okay, I guess I can work with this. And sometimes sociopaths don't tend to be as successful as psychopaths, but if that person maybe brings enough practical characteristics they can live with, they may be willing initially to overlook the rest. So no, these red flags were here from the jump.
Going back to a conversation we had previously in this series about being mindful and being aware and conscious. Because when you're mindful, aware, and conscious, you can hopefully see that Paul is exhibiting characteristics that are maybe won't be good in a marriage. But people are so easily go into denial and then get married thinking it'll get better. Well,
that's the biggest mistake a person can make. Nothing's going to get better once you're married. If anything, I put my good bet on things are probably going to get a little worse.
Yeah, I'll quote my father, who's not a therapist. He said, look, it better be so good by the time you get married, because it's only gonna
a little bit
go down.
I mean, it's possible some things could get better with time, but I have to say that it is, you're absolutely right. And every single client I have ever worked with, man or woman, gay or straight, you name it, any culture, they have said they owned it. These signs were there all along, and if anything, they feel angry at themselves, they feel ashamed and embarrassed, humiliated. Why didn't I see this sooner? And they'll own it. Family, tradition, they wanted to get married, they wanted to be a parent, they thought this person could take care of them, they felt bad for them because they had a bad childhood. Those are the reasons they get all the way in and like, we'll fix this. It's almost like, we'll get the house, and it's like a fixer-upper. We'll get the house and then we'll fix it.
Yeah.
Not a good idea.
I'll share a personal story. I had a 6-year relationship, broke up in therapy about it. We didn't break up in therapy, but I'm in my therapist's office reviewing the relationship. And I brought something up that happened in our first few weeks of dating. And that event occurred throughout our relationship. And I told my therapist, yeah, but I didn't know it was happening. He goes, yes, you did. You were in denial. I go, I wasn't in denial. I saw it happen in the beginning. He said that's not going to happen anymore. And I just didn't know it was happening. He goes, Kyle, you knew. You just chose not to see it. And I left his office angry because I go, who are you to tell me that I'm in denial? But then after a few weeks, I came back. I go, you were right. I was in denial. I saw it all along. I just chose to pretend like it wasn't there.
Or make rationalizations. The other pattern I see folks make is like, he's having a bad day at work. The kids are really noisy. His father's been really sick. Wait until we move by the new house. It never ends, right? Anyone can write those rationalizations. And while those things may be true as their causes of stress, that kind of bad behavior is unacceptable. Emotional abuse is unacceptable any day of the week.
Perfect. I want to stop it right there. That was so many great takeaways. And my big one was going to the therapist with evidence. I've never done that, and I probably should have.
Like I said, but I warn folks that before they show up to their therapist's office with like five boxes,
bringing a file cabinet,
with five boxes of records, and they end up to open their phone. Their therapist may say, I only want to hear about your reality. They don't want the therapy to be punctured by outside realities. Like I said, I respect how other therapists work, given the nature of the populations I work with, that I must say it sometimes elucidates something, and it allows them to almost feel heard, and it normalizes things for them, because they'll sometimes say, I have to show you this because otherwise I feel like no one could believe something this outlandish. I say, I believe you. If this helps you, by all means. I'm just trying to give them a sense that I'm trying to help them feel sane and whole again.
Yes.
By whatever path possible.
Yes. What's the first sign someone needs to look at as if they think somebody they know is a psychopath?
If you come to find out that they're breaking major rules, moral codes, ethical codes, or laws. Now, obviously on a first date, a person doesn't, unless they've got their I've just broke the law bracelet around their ankle. Most people
broke the law bracelet. Yes.
They're not going to. I don't think that most people are going to put their rap sheet in front of you on a first date. So but pay attention even to look at how they might handle rule breaking in a relationship. I don't know. They might take something that doesn't belong to them. If you're from a like, I don't know, place of business or a hotel or something. It may feel like a small transgression, but it'll be enough to make you uneasy. They may share something that they did at work that feels like it's on the wrong side of shady. There's enough of those little things start to accumulate. And, the danger is that you're like, wow, they're really slick. Like, they're a hustler, they're a player. Like you think you're in some sort of cool movie with them, but it's not cool. It's actually, they're breaking rules and they're doing it over and over again. And that might be a sign or a signal. They just are. And it may end up culminating in more and more stuff, and you may find it out. I think one of the most devastating things that people have said to me when they've been in relationships with psychopaths is what they learn down the road. They come to find out that this person had a history of incarceration, that they may actually be married to someone else at the same time, that they lied about their occupational history, that they lied about bills that went unpaid and which now are ruining their credit. You might go try to buy a house and find out, oh, they had 2 bankruptcies in their past or something. So it may be something you don't learn early on. Nowadays with Google, you might be able to look into people. Psychopaths have a tendency to use aliases. They may not be who you think they are.
Wow. Do psychopaths look different depending on the role they take in your life? For example, a significant other versus a coworker versus a family member.
Absolutely. You got to remember, a psychopath's front game is the best game in town. Smooth, glib, charming, intelligent, articulate, perfectly put together. I mean, you really need to know what you're looking at to be able to catch them in what they're doing. So they're going to be, if they're trying to attract you as a new partner, they're going to bring their A game. If they're trying to impress somebody in the workplace, they're going to bring their A game. However, if you're someone who's disposable or dispensable to them, or someone they view as you're in their service, God help you, is all I have to say.
If you find yourself in a relationship with a psychopath, or you believe that your husband or boyfriend, let's say, is a psychopath, are there any questions you could ask them to maybe find out if you're right?
I would say that what you want to do is look for inconsistencies in their story. And talk to people who know them. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go CSI on this and start this interrogation of everyone who's ever known them, but try to see if there's continuity, if the dates line up, if their life story lines up, if, he might have said he went to college in one place and another person's like, yeah, when they graduated, they were working at this job, and you're like, something's not adding up. Psychopaths often go out of their way to isolate their partner from other people who know their histories. Look for that pattern too. Why aren't you being introduced to anyone in their past? They'll often say, I was done wrong, and they'll make up some dramatic story about how everyone did this to them, so they have nothing to do with anyone from their past. That's pretty rare that somebody would cut off everyone, all friends, all family, all extended family. It may be that they're on a fresh start path and they're sort of reinventing themselves, and that you're in the eye line of a grifter kind of person at this point. So look for inconsistencies.
Psychopathy is not a diagnosable term.
No.
But can someone have psychopathic tendencies but not be a psychopath?
Then again, you're splitting hairs. You're splitting hairs because like psychopath, because there's no diagnosis. It's not like if you have 5 psychopathic tendencies, then you're a psychopath.
Right.
The people who have really are breaking rules in this consistent way, and they're cold, and and they fail to take responsibility, and they're deceitful, and they're manipulative, and they're exploitative. I mean, these things tend to hang together. It's very rare that a person exploits other people, but then they're really sweet, and they do bake sales, and they run a Girl Scout troop. Like, you're not going to tend to see those things kind of hanging out together. These things cluster together, so the more of them you have, the more likely you are to dealing with somebody who is truly a psychopath.
I like the takeaway of looking for inconsistencies in this person. And if you're in a relationship with them, you do have the option to leave. But if you have a coworker, for example, you can't necessarily leave them. So how do you adapt to working with a psychopath?
If you suspect you're working with a psychopath, what you want to do is you really, really, really want to cover your bases. Remember, HR is not going to help you unless you have documentation. You can't walk into HR and say, hey, the person in the next cubicle is a psychopath. They'll be like, okay, that's really
I watched
helpful.
a MedCircle video, and I just want to let you know.
So I always tell people, anytime you start on a new job, you almost have to be kind kind of paranoid. You save every email, you make folders, you get that stuff off the server, you print it off. Like, there's all these steps that you really should engage in if you think you're working with a psychopath. But you want to make sure you document things. You want to avoid having meetings with them one-on-one. You want to ensure that there's a third party present. You want to ensure minutes are being taken of meetings. You want to, most times people scan minutes and don't really pay attention. Pay attention to those minutes, because that might be the only documentation you have. And then you want to make sure you have alliances at work, people that you can trust. But what you don't want to do is gossip about the psychopath, because they're better at that than you are. Yeah. They're already stabbing you in the back and numerous other places you can't see, way ahead of you. They're going to play this game better than you. So you're best off playing a clean game than trying to beat them at their own game.
Yeah, really good advice. What about for family members? How do you know if your mom or your dad is a psychopath?
That's incredibly painful, because I got to tell you, one thing I've seen in more than a few family systems is some people refuse to believe it. Like, I refuse to believe that. We're just being dramatic, and they'll say they're not a psychopath. And so you'll have these families that'll be schismed and split. Like, people will say, I think you're exaggerating. I think that, they'll actually gaslight the person who's making the accusation. So it can be very painful. If you come into the realization that one, or God forbid, both of your parents is a psychopath, that's a very painful revelation. But I gotta tell you, you probably figured that out as a child. Psychopathic parents tend to be abusive, neglectful, manipulative. One of the more famous psychopaths out there is Bernie Madoff. Okay, he's used as a classical example of a psychopath. When you look, and he was very wealthy, and he raised his children up with tremendous comfort, he certainly wasn't beating them with a stick or, locking them in the basement or depriving them, but there was a cruel edge to him. And his kids would acknowledge that. And if you watch any retelling of that story, it's definitely not a comfortable relationship. Some people will have high-functioning psychopathic parents, a dad who's a CEO or a mom who's really, really, successful at whatever it is she's done. And they'll report like having two parents, the public person and this really cruel, invalidating, malevolent, horrible person that would come home. And they'd note the dichotomy, how seamlessly their parent would go between those two worlds. And so, and put their child through unrealistic kinds of expectations. So people, it's not like a person wakes up at 30 and says, whoa, dad was a psychopath.
Yeah.
You knew it.
Is there such thing as a self-aware psychopath?
The funny thing about psychopaths is I don't even think they'd get mad if you called them psychopaths, because they don't care what anybody thinks of them. So if you go up, they'll laugh it off. You wouldn't be like, even a narcissist would get super defensive. But a psychopath's like, you want to call me a psychopath? Call me a psychopath.
Okay, so that's how they respond, but do they think, I am a psychopath?
Yeah, no, they're not affected by the evaluations or labels placed on them by other people. What they don't like, though...
I know they're not affected by it, but do they recognize that they are a psychopath?
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, they might. In some cases, they might. And if anything, it's like there's a sadistic glee. You see what I'm saying? Like they may recognize it.
Like how cool that I got.
Like how cool, like I'm a psychopath and I'm getting away with it. Or I'm a psychopath and look how much money I'm making. Or, it's almost like if you, I don't know, it's like finding a bag of money on the street dropped by a armored truck and like no one's around and I'm picking this up and I'm walking down the street and I'm getting away with this. Yeah. Like their whole life is about getting away with stuff. So if anything, that psychopath might even be like a badge of honor. But I think they're impervious to the criticisms of other people. That's where they're different than the narcissist. The narcissists hate being criticized.
Right.
The psychopaths don't mind.
Yes. What are we not talking about when it comes to identifying a psychopath that people need to know? I
think that with a psychopath, it is really about looking for inconsistencies. Inconsistency in mood, inconsistency in life history, inconsistency in their stories. The problem is, we so want to believe when we meet someone new that their stories are real, and I've just met this super cool person, that we make the puzzle pieces fit, even when they don't. I tell people, be a cynic. When the dates don't line up, recreate it. Listen, Google's making some of this stuff possible too. And it's not like I want everyone to, like I said, go out there and play like junior detective. But if you're being isolated from anybody who knows anything about this person, pay attention to that. You know, before you entirely buy their recreation of the events, look for things that don't add up. They have this huge job, like they're so successful, but they don't have enough money to get through the month. But can you help me out this month? Like next month, the big payout's going to come out. I mean, you know, so I've got everything covered from then on in. You know, anything that feels like a hustle is probably a hustle.
Ooh.
We are seeing that there are programs like, for example, prison transition programs and, you know, other programs working with more like incarcerated, antisocial personality disordered groups that have found some utility in some forms of social skills training, group therapies, some luck with cognitive behavioral therapies. There has been some good work there. You know, listen, at the end of the day, it's like, you know, the old joke of how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but needs to want to change. It's the same thing with antisocial personality disorder. You know, the person
really
has
funny.
to need to want to change. And, you know, you may or may not have that. I have to be honest with you, it's more of those slick, glib, charming, almost if you want to call them white-collar psychopaths, that are, you're going to get absolutely nowhere there. I mean, I think there's absolutely no chance of change there. I think actually in the criminal populations, you may be able to do some level of job training, social skills training, meaning and purpose focused work. And I actually would put my bet on the incarcerated population more than I would on the sort of the slick, you know, the slick, sophisticated, successful group of psychopaths, quite frankly, because there's almost no motivation for change. They're getting rewarded for their behavior.
That's right. They're in their world, they're killing it.
They're killing it. They're killing it. And the world is telling them they're killing it too.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe cured is the wrong word.
Yeah.
Could a person who's psychopathic, could they at least get to a point where they're not breaking the rules?
I mean, that's obviously the goal, and that's the goal of, you know, rehabilitation after prison and, you know, that kind of thing, is that there is no recidivism. When we try to avoid recidivism is where we're trying to prevent a person from committing crimes again. But, you know, criminal behavior or illegal behavior is just only one part of what we see in antisocial personality disorder. We're also seeing violation of ethics or morality or social norms. So, for example, somebody who is antisocial personality or psychopathy is very likely to cheat on a romantic partner if they have one. They're going to probably keep doing that because they're really almost immune to any sense of morality. And so that's not going to change, which can make it very difficult to maintain any kind of trusting relationship with somebody like that. So I think that some of the treatment targets, maybe in terms of illegal behavior, they may be willing to bring some of that hustle, if you will, to more legal behavior, but even then you'll sort of see that their tendency is going to want to take moral and ethical shortcuts.
What does the treatment actually look like for these people?
You know, a lot of it is, again, it's cognitive behavioral. It's challenging their beliefs and changing them, their beliefs and thoughts, in a hope of changing their behavior. That's really what you're trying to do, right? And so that's where you're sort of pushing back on their cognitions, pushing back on their schemas, on their sense of how the world works, trying to enhance their sense of empathy, you know, to really help them focus on, this is how people are being hurt, especially if it's it's not like person-on-person crime, like violent crime, something that feels more remote. That to help them sort of see that this is hurting somebody else and the people around them. Now, in a person who's really a cold, stone cold psychopath, they don't care. So like, I don't care if I'm hurting someone. Right. It doesn't matter to me. Right. And so if that's the case, how are you going to make change there? If I don't think something I'm doing is wrong, like if somebody tells me tomorrow, like, it's wrong to turn off my bedroom light when I sleep, I'll be like, what?
Yeah, we're just going to
Why is that a problem?
That's a really good way to put that. That's how far it is with them.
Yeah.
I go, what do you mean? I got to make $100 million? So this is what
I'm
going to
do it. You know, and this is how I'm going to do it, and no one's going to stop me. Or it's a game. Again, I'm going to bring up the Bernie Madoff case because he's sort of like a real textbook kind of a psychopathic, antisocial personality sort of person. In some ways, it's almost like it was gamesmanship to him. At some point, how much money does one person need?
Well, isn't that the proof?
Right? It's gamesmanship.
That's the proof.
Yeah, that's all it was. And it felt like that's what it was, despite literally so many people's lives being destroyed by his decisions. It absolutely didn't even seem to, the game was more important than the other people. And that's what it is. They are players who really only care about the game.
So someone's watching this, I doubt they're psychopathic.
No,
they
I don't
probably
think
are in a relationship with somebody
Yeah.
somebody who
or
is,
a family member or
or
something.
a family member.
Or work with them.
Or work with them.
Yeah.
They are likely going to be advised to go seek therapy for themselves.
Yeah.
In that therapy session, what do they ask the therapist? Because what I want to have happen for them is that they don't have to go to 5 therapy sessions to figure out what is a psychopath and what all these things that you're educating them on, and giving them the tools to ask the therapist so that maybe in the first session they can make a ton of a gain.
It depends on the relationship with the psychopath. Is this your child? Is this your coworker? Is this your husband? You know, because obviously the nature of the relationship is going to have a lot of bearing on what you need to know. For example, if it's your child, the question a lot of parents are going to have is, am I responsible for this?
Well, we'll go into the whole child thing in our next video.
Right.
So let's assume that this is for a loved one.
So you mean like a partner?
A romantic
partner.
Yeah.
Is it possible he can change? Because he keeps telling me he will. We have kids together. Can I expect that he's going to be a decent co-parent if we have kids? Should I be scared? You know, I keep giving him second chances, but it never works out. Why not? You know, is it possible he'll change? Those are the kinds of questions you're going to, you know, that somebody should probably ask. And, you know, by and large, if that person has any expertise whatsoever in psychopathy or antisocial personality, they're going to be able to give you some straight answers on that. Like I said, these people are not made for long-term intimate relationships. They're not.
And what if somebody's in the position where their partner makes all the money, they have nothing in savings,
a common scenario.
and they have 5 kids?
Yep.
And they come to a therapist and they say, you're telling me he's not going to change and you're telling me to leave for all these reasons?
Therapists won't tell her to leave. I wouldn't tell her to leave.
Okay, then, but they're saying this is going to be really tough. And that person says, I want to stay in the relationship. Now, what's your response to that?
Then, you see, I'll say, look at the history of what it's been like so far. That's how it's going to keep being. Okay? He has not been listening to you. He's not going to start. He has been cheating on you. He's going to continue. He's been disrespecting you. That's going to keep going. Like everything you're seeing, I said, at least you already have the roadmap. Expect nothing. You know, expect nothing.
Do you help them with coping strategies?
Things like continuing, if they can, continue to stay in therapy. Group therapy. I do ensure that people, women in particular, who are in relationships with men who have antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, have access to domestic violence resources, because that's not an uncommon pattern in these relationships. Encourage them to cultivate some of their own interests. Encourage them to cultivate friendships, and their partner will probably try to isolate them from those friendships, but create, you know, even if it's online communities. You know, and I do want to tell MedCircle listeners, the guidance we're giving right now is not meant to serve a person who is in a violent relationship. If you are in a relationship where you or other children or other dependent adults in your environment are in danger, you must seek help immediately. You must seek domestic violence services, law enforcement, and keep in mind, if you're researching those resources online on a computer, make sure you clear out your cache every time, because it's not unusual in those relationships for a partner to go through and search everything you've searched. It's that level of control. So, I mean, I do want listeners to understand that what we're talking about is situations where it has not escalated to violence, financial abuse, things that are putting you at abject risk. This is not a substitute for the guidance somebody needs in that kind of a situation. Yes. And it can go there. And with psychopaths, not uncommon.
Is creating an exit strategy for the relationship ever part of therapy?
It is a part of it. Now, unfortunately, this is where you start sadly getting sometimes into the world of restraining orders and really painful custody hearings. If the antisocial personality pattern has more financial resources than you, they may try to crush you in court. They will be able to charm the judge. They will be able to charm the attorneys. They'll be able to charm the custody evaluators. I have seen these things go really, really badly for people. People losing custody of their children, people getting limited custody. Sometimes the psychopathic parent wants custody of that child, not because they're interested in the child, but to stick it to the other parent, which is not good for anyone in this situation. So I do tell people, you need a plan, you need a strategy, you need supports, and after all that, it still may not go your way. And I wish I could give people like a really sugar-coated version of this, but people say, well, the judge is going to see right through him. Not necessarily.
Well, I'm glad you're not giving a sugar-coated version, because what we're doing here is giving the reality of mental health. And the reality on this topic is what you have just described. And let's not move away from reality because it makes us feel good in the moment. Let's lean into it so we can work within the realms of what's real and make the best decisions as we possibly can. And I think you've given a lot of our viewers actionable steps to take.
Absolutely, but you have to, I mean, these relationships can become dangerous.
Yes.
You know, and it's also, listen, I'll tell you this, if a person's psychopathic or antisocial personality partner is really high functioning, they are like the head of a company or some sort of like really high up in a political structure or something like that, the world may not believe them. And that's even more horrifying. And in fact, women who are more wealthy are often less likely to seek out domestic violence resources, which is not an uncommon situation in these relationships. I mean, this is a dark space. And again, I think some people may be watching now and scratching their head and saying, how did a person not see this? How did they get in the first place? Listen, and you know, a lot of flash, a lot of sizzle, everyone around you saying, oh my gosh, he's so generous. He's so nice. Oh my God, he's flying all of us on this great vacation, or, you know, he's taking care of you, or he's actually, you know, let's say you have a child and he's offering to take care of the child too. That all looks really good to the world. And a lot of people don't stop under those circumstances to ask the right questions.
Well, that's a really good takeaway for people who knows somebody who's in a relationship with a psychopath, to make sure you ask and check in. And when I sat down with Kevin Hines, who survived what normally would be fatal jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, he really drove home the point of checking in with people, asking, how are you, but meaning it. Not the, oh, hi there, how are you, good. That's surface. No one's ever listening to that. But really going, hey, you're in a relationship with this person. But how is it? How are you feeling when you're in a relationship with them?
People don't often like to pull back that curtain. I don't know whether it's because they don't want to know the answer or whether they feel like they're prying, that it feels impertinent or something like that. Especially if, I mean, I think even if you don't know someone well, it's okay to say, you've met them, how are you? Like, is it good? Is it a good relationship?
Absolutely.
I think people are often like, what? Why would you even ask me that? I think it's an interesting question, because if it's a great relationship and it's healthy, you'd say, I'm so fortunate, like it's a really, really happy relationship. At a minimum, it would make anyone stop and think.
Dr. Ramani, explain why first a child cannot be diagnosed as a psychopath.
Because it is a pattern, a diagnostic kind of a label that's saved for people over the age of 18. Antisocial personality disorder is not diagnosed until somebody is over 18. But in children, we can look for patterns that really conform to delinquency. These can be milder patterns like truancy, cheating on school assignments, to more severe ones like physically or sexually assaulting peers. It could be things like torturing animals, setting fires. All of these behaviors, you know, if you have, I think, 3 or more of these kinds of behaviors, they qualify a child to be diagnosed with something called conduct disorder. Now, these kids typically get handled through school and juvenile justice systems. They may be placed in special school settings. They may be sent to sort of special boarding school settings if the family has the money. Sadly, some of them may end up in juvenile detention settings as well, where we know they're grouped in with other kids doing these things, so sometimes they actually learn more criminality in those settings. So if you're noticing these patterns in a child, they're bullying, any of those things, you want to act swiftly.
Early intervention.
Early and intensively. I think part of the reason this is always so tricky is that sometimes it's kids being kids. It's, that childhood play and all those childhood fights, that's just kids being kids, that's boys being boys. And that's often used as a defense of something that people could get ahead of. But it's also not that simple. Nowadays, we have a new issue to look at with kids, and that's their online activity. Yeah. You may not have a kid who's going to school and making trouble there, but what you might have is a child who's really getting into some dark online spaces, whether through social media or even websites and sort of social networks that aren't that as commonly used. You want to watch their video game play. While the research associating violent video game play or video game play and violent behavior is equivocal at best. We're not seeing consistent patterns there. Is your child locked up in a room all day playing those video games by themselves? Are they socially isolated? How do they treat their siblings? Are they interactive at family gatherings, or are they distant and remote? So there's a lot of places you can witness this child, and there's a lot of ways. It's not just the acting out. Some of it is also that extreme social withdrawal. You're their parent. They don't get cybersecurity. You get to go through their stuff.
Right. And that's a good thing.
Yes, it is a good thing.
Like, if you're at the position as a parent where you feel like your kid is exhibiting some of these signs and symptoms, be happy that at least they're not 18, so that you
might
take
be able to
control
get
of the
it. You can take
situation.
control. And a lot of parents, listen, a lot of these kids are more savvy in the electronic spaces than their parents are.
That's for sure.
So they're able to, really bury things, and they might be on websites and extreme websites that parents don't even know exist. So it's getting more and sometimes more and more challenging to monitor all of these kinds of situations where kids could be going down some really perilous places. At that point, you can really only engage in early intervention, like I said, in part through the schools, in part through people who have this as a specialization, and at that point, hope for the best.
I talk to so many of our viewers, and so it helps me learn what helps them. And one of the things that they've shared with me is that when they're watching videos like this, and you just said, look at if they're isolating, if they interact with people at family functions, and you went through this list. Go back in this video, play those responses again that Dr. Ramani just gave, and write down those questions, and over the next week, 2 weeks, a month, write down what you're observing, because we get so caught up in getting the kids to school, getting to work, packing lunches, we miss the parenting part sometimes.
We don't always pay attention.
No, and so if you write that down and you actually take the time to look and write out, then you can take something to a therapist and say, this is what I've been observing, right? So we have some track record here, and we start to expedite the process of therapy so that they get as much correct information as possible.
And one thing that's also tricky, Kyle, is, and as a parent I can understand this, is some parents just are in a place of denial. They don't want to even let themselves go there. Like, it's terrifying to think, not only could something be wrong, but your child potentially could be dangerous to other people. And parents think, well, maybe it'll be different in a new school. Maybe it'll be different next year.
Maybe this is a phase.
Maybe this is a phase, exactly. Yeah. Maybe it is. But better that you do explore it instead of saying 2 years later, I wish I had started something back then and started trying to get to the bottom of this. It's hard. If the child is oppositional enough, even getting them into a mental health practitioner may get you nowhere. But I think for parents to at least know that you gave it a shot, the more resources you throw at something early, the more likely you are to have a good outcome.
Yes. What do you wish more parents would be doing?
I think I wish more parents would be willing to have emotional conversations with their kids early. I have to say that we're having a real crisis of emotional expression in our culture. And I think sadly it's concentrated in men and boys, where we're not giving them permission to talk about their feelings. We view vulnerability as weakness. We view talking about feelings as weakness. We feminize it, and that's supposed to make it weak too. And I think a lot of some of the bubble ups we see in men are just an inability to talk about their feelings, their fears, their anxieties, their vulnerabilities. And I think sometimes parents are even afraid to go there, to open those Pandora's boxes. And with technology, kids have become sort of almost like we're speaking two different languages in a household. And it's just to give permission to those conversations. And I think parents often feel they have to give solutions to their kids. Sometimes all you need to do is let them talk. Let them talk and listen. I have to catch myself on that all the time. I happen to have a very long commute to school for my daughter. I used to try to say, well, let's fix it. And it took me a while to say, I'm going to let her talk. I'm going to let her talk and talk and talk and not try to bring a solution to it every time, and which is hard. when you're a psychologist?
Well, I find that funny that it's hard. I would think it'd be so easy for you to just listen because you are a psychologist.
But it's your kid.
But it's your kid. You want to fix your kid.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think many parents, even well-intentioned, are, it's time. Like you said, you come home, you're making dinner, you're running around, you're doing homework. This whole sort of like, let's just sort of climb under the covers and have an emotional conversation. When does that happen? Make the time. Make the time.
You just caused a light bulb to go off in my head. I've shared in our depression series with Dr. Sue Varma that at 9 years old, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, completely suicidal, was put on Prozac, and I shared more of my depression story throughout that. But throughout my life. But during that time, I remember I'd have episodes of like I would say panic or anxiety or just really emotional outbursts. And I would end up in my room in bed and I would be just wishing that my mom would come in and talk to me. I wouldn't go to her.
You wouldn't go ask her,
ever.
right?
No, I would never go talk to her.
That's such an important thing to share.
And I was like, oh gosh, I hope so. And when I would hear that knock on that door open, it was just like relief came because I go, she's going to let me talk now.
Yeah.
And it was such I didn't realize it then until you just said that, of letting them talk.
Yep.
Giving me that outlet to be like, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm talking about. Because for whatever reason, I couldn't manage it in a healthy way.
I think we as parents, it's not we don't wait for our child to come get us.
Good.
We have to be the early warning mechanisms. We have to check in on our children. That balance will shift one day. Yeah. That won't forever be our responsibility. But it really is about paying attention. And again, it's something I've been rueful about myself as a parent, very busy. And there have been times I wanted to give advice when all she needed was an ear. And I guess we learn and we evolve and we keep trying to get it right.
If a parent does take their kid to a therapist and they are diagnosed with, I always forget the name.
Conduct disorder.
What are the chances with the right intervention that this kid will not develop psychopathic tendencies as an adult?
My knowledge base in this area isn't good enough for me to give you a specific probability. I would be uncomfortable doing that because this is such a high stakes game.
Sure.
Let me put it this way. Your stakes are much, much better if you do take them to a therapist than if you don't.
Yes.
You're improving your odds. I think a lot of it's going to depend on the child's pattern of behavior, the environments they find themselves in, the resources to help the child. There will be other adjunctive programs around that child. For example, there are some programs that use things like martial arts and those kinds of like physical kinds of programs to actually channel some of the strong feelings these kids have into the discipline of martial arts. So you'll see some of those kinds of programs. Somebody I know works on those kinds of programs with gang-affiliated youth. So there's different kinds of innovative programs out there that meet kids where they are at, using art, using music, using physicality, that you want to use as many of these resources as possible to give that child a chance to express themselves where they may not be able to find the words, they may be able to find another outlet.
Give us a few tips for parents on those initial therapy visits with that child.
When you bring a child in for therapy initially, now while different therapists who work with kids under 18 work differently, most of them, almost all of them, are going to want to meet with the parents once and sit with you, because many times a child won't be able to relate their own developmental history, like were there any birth complications or their milestones or all of that. So they'll need the parents to do that. And then you'll have to work out with the therapist sort of how you're going to communicate about it. With a child who's well into adolescence, that child might want a private space, and then you agree with the therapist on when she will contact you or he will contact you. If the child's in danger, if there's symptomatology they're concerned about, you want to make sure that the adolescent feels fine with that. With younger children, it's less of an issue. That tends to be more of an open book and more open conversation. You as a parent should ask them questions on how they work with your child and what kinds of things that they're going to be expecting of your child. Will they expect your child to do anything between sessions? So I think that it ends up becoming collaborative. I also have to say, Kyle, it can be useful for families to enter family therapy where everybody's in the room. Mom, dad, or whoever the caregivers, whether it's two caregivers, whether it's a single parent, siblings, and the child, because these tend to be systemic issues. I think there's a real risk of sort of labeling that one child as the problem child, which that child is probably already experiencing that sense of identity within the family, especially if their other siblings are playing by the rules and they're not. That by having family therapy, there could be a chance for everyone to kind of get a little bit more aware of the dynamics. But it's early intervention, it's regular intervention, it's multimodal intervention, meaning we're using different techniques to help them out, it's monitoring, and then it's a leap of faith.
The stakes are never higher when it comes to a child.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And what are we not telling parents about psychopathic tendencies in their kids that we need to be telling them?
You know, we're learning more and more about this. I mean, I think it's something that movies sometimes show in this kind of scary horror film kind of sequence. It's an area where there are some specialists who are doing work in this area. It is hard because there's so many moving parts here. Listen, for the child who's coming from a really abusive, deprived, violent home, I'm not so sure that they're going to be watching this. If the parents are abusing them, I don't know that they're watching videos to figure out how to help their kid. So those kids are likely potentially to have poorer outcomes because there's nobody looking out for them.
It could be an aunt who got custody of the kid or something who's now trying to fix it.
But in that kind of scenario, exactly, now that the child has a consistent caregiver to that family member or someone else who may have stepped in this child's life, regular intervention. And that child may be really diffident and have their arms curved, you know, they're going to do that. Yeah. They're going to stonewall, and they're a child. And you're going to keep trying to find that way to get in to them. And that's why therapists use all kinds of techniques, even playing games with a child. I mean, therapists who work with children tend very, very creative and very gifted. It's very difficult work to do, and there are people out there who specialize in this, and there are also experts who sort of cross that line between sort of the justice system and psychology, who sort of are working, you know about the cutting edge programs for young people who are vulnerable to either developing criminal behavior or who are you engaging in it.
I want to thank you first for sharing that, because this is hopefully, and I believe, will change the path of so many kids.
I hope so. I don't think that people understand, and I think for me, especially on a day I'm clinically working with clients, is the devastation that's wrought when somebody abuses a child.
Yeah.
For me, it's a passion. It's a fight. It's an absolute. There's something about it, that the sheer innocence of a child, that they place their trust in the adults around them, and that trust is betrayed. That ramification is lifelong. Yeah. It is self-doubt. It is sometimes self-harm. It can be mental illness. On the bright side, yes, we often can see resilience and growth and empathy and lots of other things. And we can also see darker patterns like psychopathy and sociopathy. But I think that I cannot stress enough how important it is to safeguard our children. They are our children. They're not your children or my children. They are our children. These are the people who will be taking care of the world as we get older. And our complete disregard sometimes for the welfare of children is concerning for me. This is why I want people to listen to this and really get that sense that pay attention to the kids around you. Pay close attention. Because for many folks I've worked with over the years, even students I've talked to, if one person had listened to them and paid attention to them when they were children, things could have turned out quite differently.
Yes. You mentioned in previous videos that people know once they become an adult if their parent has an antisocial personality disorder.
They may not know the label for it, but the odds are if they had a psychopathic parent or a sociopathic parent or antisocial personality parent, I should say, they would have either had a parent who abandoned the family. That would have been very common, like disappeared, or who physically harmed them, either themselves or their mother, or other people in the family, or who might have gone to jail, for really committing some sort of heinous crime. So there's going to be some sort of ringer. They just may not know what it's called, but they'll know.
They know something was off.
They'll know. Yeah, it's not subtle. It's not subtle.
How many of these kids who are now adults have relationships with their parents who are psychopathic psychopathic or sociopathic?
You know, it depends. It really depends on the nature of the parent's transgressions. Obviously, if somebody abandoned the child, some people out of curiosity as an adult may circle back and want to try to have a relationship with that parent. If they were horribly abused by that parent, they often won't. But, listen, it's amazing how many people who had abusive parents still stay in the game with their parents. I don't know, maybe it's almost like a loop. They get stuck in still trying to think they can win them over, or something would change their behavior. So some do, certainly. Many don't, because of the parents' transgressions were either so awful or just pull them out of the child's life and never to come back again.
Well, I think out of all the categories, children and parents are the most difficult, because I do have the choice, even though it might be very difficult, to leave a partner. I do have a choice to quit my job if my boss has antisocial personality disorder, but I can't go get a new biological mother, and I can't go have, I guess I could have another kid, but I still got the one that I have,
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're talking about it being your parent, can you quit a parent? Sure.
You're right.
You can.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, I think that the heartbreak I see in folks is when they realize their parent just did a bad job. They were neglectful, they were abusive, they just were not, they should not have been a parent, bottom line.
Yeah.
That awareness is devastating, because you're right, you do only get one set of parents. Now, and they may not always be biological parents, Kyle. Sometimes adoptive parents come into the scene in that person's life, and that's the only parent they know.
Certainly.
It may be it could be a more complex dynamic if that adoptive parent abused them, making them wonder, could this have gone a different way? But ultimately, it's the sense of loss of, I feel like I've been robbed. I could have had a healthy parental relationship, which is such an important relationship, not only for a child, obviously, critically important for a child, but also even in adulthood. Person feels something's been stolen from them. However, I think then that's getting caught up in somebody being given a job they probably weren't good at, which is namely your parent. Some people who are good at this actually seek out mentoring figures in other adults. It may be a grandparent, it could be an aunt or an uncle, it could be some other trusted adult in the family system, or it could even be a mentor they meet along the way at the university, at high school, in a job, that they find someone who becomes that fathering or mothering figure to them, and they have that relationship. There's still a yearning. Gosh darn it, I only wish this had been the parent I had been born to. Life doesn't always look the way we want it to, and by fighting, say, this is my parent, it needs to be right, and fighting for something that's completely futile that you're never going to get, that feels like a waste of time.
So I want to break this into two categories then. The first category is for the people who are in the position where, look, I go to Thanksgiving every year and I see my parent, and I have to know how to deal with that. And the second one is for the people who say, you know what, I've moved on from them, I've separated, but I do need to recover from what I went through.
That's fair.
And perhaps both people need to recover. So let's start with the first one. What do you tell the people who still want or feel like they need to have a relationship with their parent?
When people feel like they need that, then I say to them, you got to manage your expectations. You got to get realistic about this. They're never going to be your cheerleader. They may be downright jealous of you. They may try to undermine you. They may try to take money or resource from you. They may try to manipulate you, because these are all the things they've already done. Right. So they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
So can you go, instead of waiting for something, you're waiting for that I love you that may never come, or that I'm proud of you that may never come. And so you're waiting for something that may not arrive. That can be heartbreaking. But if you can say, listen, I want to know I like the idea that I have a parent out there somewhere, and I know they're always going to get it wrong. If you can get down with that and really manage your expectations, then go ahead, have your relationship with them. But to keep being surprised that they're acting badly after a lifetime of acting badly, it actually feels illogical.
It is illogical.
And this is illogical because it's a matter of the heart. But you have to be realistic about the expectations you bring into the situation.
That is, first of all, so simple.
It is.
My favorite things are the simple ones, though, because they're often underrated and the most powerful.
Yes.
This has been going on your entire life. Just because you're an adult now and can point at what it is doesn't mean it's now going to be different.
Nope. And if you could just let it go, put it down, realize this is the hand you were dealt.
Yeah.
And just like in a casino, sometimes you're going to have to fold the hand and say, I'm done playing this table. I'm good.
You know, you say let it go, and for me, it translates to forgive. And you're getting that, Jake, and I want to hear all about that response, because my definition of forgiveness is giving up hope that the past could have been any different. It doesn't mean I say what you did was okay. No, it was terrible. But I'm going to give up the idea that my childhood could have gone any differently, because it couldn't have.
That's fair. I actually, what you're describing, I tend to use the word acceptance.
Acceptance.
I use the word acceptance. Forgiveness to me is this happened and I no longer resent you for it. There are not many people I know who reach that bar. Like, I forgive people who might cancel dinner plans. I can live with that. I don't know that I would forgive someone who fundamentally betrayed my trust. It depends. But only you know.
We could have a whole conversation about the forgiveness.
Only you know. It's about forgiveness. Here's the problem with forgiveness.
Okay.
When we hand it over to another person, we expect them to treasure it and to treat it as the really almost divine gift that it is, which is, thank you so much for this, because it feels almost like absolution, right? I'm going to honor this and I'm going to get it right. And I am so sorry for the hurt I caused you. Thank you. Thank you for seeing through to this better part of me. And they make real change. That's an example of forgiveness working out. But where forgiveness can be devastating is when you go out of your way to forgive someone and they turn around and they do it right back to you again.
Which they would do. Yeah, for me, forgiveness is not even about that other person. For me, it's all about me.
Yeah, okay.
It's me really taking a moment with myself to go, you know what? That's something that happened. It's out of my control now.
Okay.
I'm either going to dwell on this and get angry and ruminate on it, or I'm going to go.
And you're okay with them doing it again?
If I'm not okay with it, but I accept that that's their behavior.
Okay.
Accept. Yes.
That's why I call it acceptance.
And if I've made the choice to have them in my life, then I have to know it's coming.
Because so if you forgive them, because forgiveness to me is very much and many people argue what you do philosophically. Forgiveness is an act to the self. Okay?
Yes.
It's for the self.
Yes.
So but to me that's letting go. Like I can say, let go of something. When you let go of something, it doesn't necessarily mean you've let go of the resentment. Does that make sense? Like, I've
100%.
let this go. I'm going to tell you, though, it's changed this relationship.
Yeah.
That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is really kind of like a little bit more of a reset. Now, if you read Desmond Tutu's work on this, and he was Nobel Prize winner from South Africa. If you read his work, he gives a much more nuanced take on forgiveness, and actually his work is some of my favorite work on forgiveness, because he really does say, like, this has changed the DNA of this relationship forever. There's no getting past that. But I mean, I think we're talking about that, so we're circling around that drain of forgiveness, letting go, and acceptance. But people use the word acceptance, but they don't really mean it. They'll say, I accept this. What do you mean you just did that to me again? I'm like, well, slow down, sister. You just said that you accepted that.
Yeah.
I didn't really mean it. Well, then you didn't accept it and you didn't forgive it. So be clear on the terms. And listen, some people, you might really transgress on them and they may truly forgive it. And they'll be like, okay, and you're going to do it again? And you're going to do it again? And that's not what most people have signed up for.
Yeah.
And sometimes when people feel like, I've given you this divine gift of my forgiveness and you keep abusing it, that feels like utter devastation to people.
In your practice, do you find that your patients talk about their parents a lot?
Number one.
Right?
We don't start there.
That's like the stereotype of Freud and all that.
You know what? We don't start there. We start on what brought them in, which could be marital problems, work problems, low self-esteem, problems with their weight, anything. But it's current. The stuff is rarely does a person come in and say, "I'd like to unearth the damage I underwent at the hands of my mother."
I'd like to start with this.
What happened 35 years ago?
Right.
At some point, though, especially since my work is in people who are trying to be survivors of narcissistic, psychopathic, or other sort of toxic relationships, if you will, I need to understand where their precedent came from. Why do they think enduring this is okay? And many times we get some of those answers in their childhoods. That's why we explore there. I'm not a psychoanalytically trained or a psychodynamically oriented therapist, but I do very much believe that when we look at the patterns of someone's life, we learn about things like attachment, the nature of their sense of security in their close relationships. We learn what they were rewarded for and what they weren't rewarded for, or if they were rewarded at all. We learn what they learned about love and what a relationship looks like. We learn if they've had a history of trauma. We get a lot from understanding those early relationships.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful for people to hear, because hopefully they have or will take the step to go into therapy and not be afraid to talk about the truth when it comes to their parents. I have found in my personal experience going to therapy that I often protected my parents to the therapist. He would ask me a question point blank, and I would paint it so that my parents looked better than maybe they actually were. And I found myself doing that, and then of course we discussed why I was doing that. But coming from that honest place of your upbringing is super powerful in therapy.
Yeah, and it's not always easy. People feel they're being disloyal. It's something that goes back to childhood. You know, children feel incredibly loyal to their parents. And so even as adults, we hold on to some of that and coming out about them. And also some of it's self-protective, and therapy doesn't need to, because the therapist is probably never going to meet your parents. Your parents might even be dead. You know, and people still feel that it's deeply disloyal. So it's an interesting space for people, how protective they can even be of their abusers. You know, when they talk about those histories down the road.
I think I know the answer to this, but do you find that people who were raised by parents or a parent with antisocial personality disorder end up in a relationship with somebody who is perhaps in an antisocial?
People who witness abusive relationships as children, there's a risk that they may enter those relationships. At some level, violence got normalized. At some level, they think that might be all they deserve. Likely where there was domestic violence, there was also, at a minimum, verbal abuse of those children, if not also physical abuse. So it's a sense of devaluation. That's why I was saying I get so angry when I hear that children were exposed to early traumatizing environments, because it changes their worldview, and more importantly, their view of themselves, and then ultimately the choices that they make. Now that, again, I always want to stress to listeners, if you came from a family of origin where there was antisocial personality or psychopathy and there was abuse, are you doomed to repeat those cycles? No. A lot of this is awareness, that you actually go out of your way, you get therapy, you're very mindful and aware. It's when you're not aware, it's when you are in denial, that you're at risk of making those kinds of errors again.
Yes, but it's the awareness followed by the action. It's the awareness and then going to therapy. It's the awareness and seeking out this education. It's the awareness and talking with a friend, so getting the support system. That action is so critical.
But it's also the awareness and being mindful. And allowing yourself, when a signal's given to you, it's only useful if you're willing to heed it.
Isn't that the truth? That is the truth. Say that one more time.
When a signal is given to you, and there's lots of them in these relationships.
There's lots of them.
It's only useful if you heed that signal.
Yes.
And when a lot of people realize, like, there was that signal, and I chose to overlook it for any number of reasons, had they stepped and walked away then,
so much better.
Yeah.
I've done that many times.
Yeah.
I actually last night was telling my friend, I said, when this thing happened in my relationship, I should have just called it, but I didn't.
You know, but Kyle, here's where I'm going to be kind to you and everyone listening.
Please,
and to myself,
be kind,
is that there's a point at which sometimes if we walk away too soon, we then get forever sort of hamstrung by the itch of regret. Did I step away too soon? What I want is for people to feel that they can take that moment, take in the information and the experiences around them, trust their feelings, and when it starts feeling uncomfortable, that they can give themselves permission to either communicate about it or walk away with the least damage possible. If you did walk away at that first signal, you might have spent the rest of your life wondering, well, was I too much of a cut and run guy? Like, did I not give this a full chance? Versus, I saw this thing through, and if anything, I stayed at the funeral way too long. This body was buried and the food and wine were gone, and I was still standing there.
You are 100% right. You are 100% right. And I do take some bit of, I feel good about that, knowing that. Well, at least I know.
I know.
This was not
There's
it.
no, and my goal is to get people away from like obsessing over those lingering doubts. Like this doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
Pay attention to those signals.
Yeah.
Seek out help. Communicate some. And if when you communicate with a partner, for example, you're getting very strange pushback, or you're getting a lot of projection, or they're blaming you.
Yeah. Pete, it's already hard to go to work every day.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in an earlier series that anywhere between about 4 or 5% to 21% of major corporations have a CEO.
Yeah. I mean, those are the
Who's a
statistics that have been
psychopath.
floated
That's
out
the
there.
statistics.
Yeah.
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 So what is someone to do?
I mean, I think that it really comes down to how close you are to that psychopathic leader. That psychopathic leader may be running the whole show. Now, that's not going to make it easy because the culture sort of trickles from the top down, right?
Yeah.
So a really psychopathic boss can make for a really toxic culture where there's lots of backstabbing and subterfuge and lying and deceit and people throwing each other under the bus. And so it can be a really toxic workplace when it's somebody at the top. You may not have day-to-day contact with the person at the top of the ship, but you may have, contact with people in the middle who are still impacted by that kind of company culture. In terms of what you are to do, in the long term, it's not something you can do much about. I mean, certainly we've seen in the last few years more and more reports of the real dangers of abusive workplaces and what people have endured in those settings. And honestly, how many people said, when I even did say something, I wasn't believed, or I was told by people, don't say anything because that person's protected because they're making too much money for this company.
Right.
There's a reality there. In this sort of David and Goliath battle, you're not going to win. You're really not. And I wish I could sit here and say, no, really, and you can go to HR and you can get an attorney and it's all going to be a happy ending. It may very well not be. And by the time this whole story plays out, you may be so shredded psychologically that the battle may not be worth it. So it's really about choosing your battles and being very realistic about how it's all going to turn out. But all of that said, when you are in these workplaces where maybe your direct report, somebody you report to directly, is a psychopath, the key, again, it's something I've talked about in other MedCircle videos, is document, document, document. Because as I said, if you do decide to go down the path of talking to HR, they're only going to be able to work with documentation. A lot of people don't like to hear this, but it's a realistic piece of feedback, is that sometimes you simply can't win in those workplaces. Either you be willing to take on the litigation, and really, I tip my hat to your courage, and also I'm rooting for you to succeed at it. Some people don't have the resources, the patience, the time. They may not be, some industries, it would just sort of end up, if it doesn't go the way you hope, you may never be able to work in that industry again. So it can be a really, really painful sort of a decision to pursue it. Sometimes the easiest thing is to find a new position. But for some people that's hard, because that psychopathic supervisor or boss may not give them a good recommendation to go off into the sunset with. So you really may end up being hurt by this time spent with this psychopathic boss. So, it can be quite bleak depending on the situation.
What does a psychopathic boss look like?
They're very toxic. They tend to lie.
I thought you were going to say they're very tall.
Yeah, no. Well, they could be.
Because you said toxic.
No, in fact, if anything, I could be there quite short too. But they're very toxic. They're very. They tend to lie. They tend to manipulate. They tend to play people against each other. They thrive under division. They like it when there's lots of infighting because it tends to benefit them. They can be quite abusive. Yelling, screaming, hostility, yelling things that you would think would get them into legal or at least HR trouble, but it doesn't. They tend to take credit for stuff that they're not responsible for. They steal other people's ideas. They have inhumane demands on their workers. They show absolutely no empathy to them. They're punitive. They hire fire with almost frivolously. They abuse their underlings. They may be inappropriate with the people they work with sexually or otherwise. So it's a bad scene. It's a bad scene.
And there's no way as an employee to manage them.
First of all, they have power over you in this system.
Right.
Now, like I said, in the best telling of the story, you save all your information, you have the smoking gun, you show up at HR, that there's somebody above this person in the pecking order, and they say, we don't care how much profit they make for us, we run a clean workplace, we're going to get rid of them, and we're going to give you a promotion. I wish that's how the story goes. It so often isn't, and many people will report the processes that they were made to go through to turn, to sort of drop a dime, if you will, or really, come clean to how horrible a psychopathic supervisor or boss was. It's re-traumatizing, and like, this isn't even worth it anymore. And so it can break a person, and it's your work, it's your livelihood.
And because a psychopathic boss is usually very good at their job in terms of making money or in terms of being successful.
Whatever the outcome is, whatever that looks like.
Right, I forgot about that. So, of course, the company is going to
They don't want it to be
that.
true. They don't want it to be true, right? Because this person is really willing to do sometimes the dark and dastardly things you need to do to succeed in certain sectors. And so it's and they'll try to argue like, listen, my management techniques are being misinterpreted. One person's intimidation is another person's sort of, hard driving kind of supervisor.
If somebody decides that they don't want to pursue action with HR and they don't want to leave their job, what advice do you give them?
Number one, you've got to take care of you. It can be, you'll be horribly depressed on Sunday nights when you face another day at that workplace. It is important that you seek out therapy. Therapy is a confidential space. Keep that in mind. I do let people know, though, if you are going to pursue civil litigation, they will try to get your therapist's records. So just, be open with your therapist that this is a possibility too. I'm just preparing people for the worst case scenarios, and really psychopathic bosses in workplaces, they're going to go in and try to do a smear campaign on you. So you have to be prepared for all those things, but get the help you need. Build friendships in the workplace. I was reading a very interesting study recently, and they were talking about how when you have a toxic or psychopathic boss, their underlings may actually unite against their single enemy, if you will, common enemy. And sometimes they end up either going off and starting their own startups or creating creative problem-solving solutions, like creating their own community independent of the psychopathic boss. Like, they unite and provide each other support.
And then, of course, the psychopath boss goes, well, yeah, because I am their boss.
I made them I'm a visionary leader. Or he may get
leader.
Really paranoid, or she may get really paranoid.
Yeah.
Why is everyone uniting against me? But either way, you might be able to find support in other rank and file people you work with. And you may not even be rank and file. I've worked with people who are at an executive level, and it's the person at the next executive level that's causing them misery.
Right.
So it's not, it can be at the top of the top, it could be down lower. It doesn't matter. It's just that person has power over you. But it's to get the support you need, take care of you, and then slowly start working on that exit strategy. Yeah. These kinds of experiences are what have led some people to actually pursue new career paths, go back to school, do things that they never thought of, like move to another country. Like, some people just view it as the wake-up call it is, and for some people it's utter devastation. They may have worked for decades to establish themselves in a career to simply watch it get stolen from them by one boss.
Well, if it's not your boss, it could be your coworker.
Yeah.
What advice do you have when dealing with a coworker, which is a different dynamic?
With a coworker, it's actually, in some ways, it can be strangely a little more problematic because you're almost a little less protected. At least when it's from the top down, you can show more negative effects on your job. Like if you get a demotion or something, you can probably plead your case better. But when it's a coworker, they may be impeding your progress in your career, again, by stealing your ideas, by creating alliances with coworkers and turning them against you, by spreading lies about you in the workplace. It's really easy to try to get in the gutter around this stuff. For example, to complain in social media, I have a psychopathic boss, I have a psychopathic coworker. coworker, never go there. That kind of stuff is a big no-no where HR is concerned, and then they'll have grounds to dismiss you.
That's right. You're just hurting yourself.
Some people are just so desperate in these situations, they want to put the cry for help out there to their community. Social media is not private, it's public. It's a public space. So you have to be very judicious about how you try to get that support from other people. Social media is not the way. Talk to friends, to talk to a therapist, document. Make sure you have everything covered, all your I's dotted, all your T's crossed. A psychopathic coworker could be finding your vulnerability, your chink in the armor, and use that against you. So you need to make sure that you're as sewn up as possible.
I understand that. Excellent advice, and thank you again for walking our viewers through how they can deal with people in their life who may have an antisocial personality disorder in all aspects.
Subscribe below, and remember, this video just scratched the surface. For more in-depth videos on mental health topics, go to medcircle.com and join for free.